This sleek, state-of-the-art submarine named Ran was sent to explore the depths of Antarctica. But as soon as it discovered something, it mysteriously disappeared. So, what happened? It all started when scientists wanted to explore one of the most remote and mysterious places on Earth, the Dotson Ice Shelf in West Antarctica. This ice shelf, silent giant, stretches 30 miles wide. That's almost the length of New York City. It stands between two icy promontories, the Martin and Bear Peninsulas, and it hides an entire world of geological mysteries. If you think that Antarctica is nothing but a desert of super thick snow and ice, you're wrong. There are entire landscapes hidden deep down there. The underside of the Dotson Ice Shelf is a rugged, dynamic terrain shaped by the slow, relentless forces of nature. There are towering ice formations, deep troughs, and bizarre structures stretching for hundreds of feet. Scientists are super curious about it, but as you can imagine, this landscape isn't easy to explore at all. To find out more, we have to scan the area with satellites or try drilling through the snow, trying to collect the big picture, piece by piece. But these methods only gave us vague hints. The real breakthrough happened when scientists came up with the idea to let the submarines explore it. Autonomous submersibles could swoop deep into the icy waters beneath the Dotson Ice Shelf and tell us what's up down there. These robotic explorers have fantastic advanced sonar systems. It's that thing that bats or dolphins do. They can use sound to see the world. Basically, they send out sound waves underwater, and when those waves hit something like the ice shelf above or the seafloor below, they bounce back to the system. Animals feel how long it took for the sound waves to return and how they changed. And this helped them understand what's located where. For example, clicks that dolphins send out tell them where the fish are. We copied this crazy evolutionary trick and adapted it to our underwater exploration. Only our version is much cooler, with a higher level of precision, so we created detailed maps of the environment. The Ran submarine was one of those robotic explorers. It was named after the Norse deity of the sea. Ran had been meticulously programmed to navigate a treacherous landscape of Antarctica. But even with all this training, its journey led to an unexpected and eerie end. In 2019, Ran was sent to explore the depths beneath the Dotson Ice Shelf. It was a hero, the first one to go on a mission like this. The team said it was like seeing the other side of the moon. For 27 straight days, it worked tirelessly. It traveled over 620 miles beneath the thick ice. That's like a journey from Paris to Berlin. Ran went further and deeper than anyone could have imagined. At one point, it reached over 10 miles into the glacier's belly, and what it discovered down there was astonishing. Scientists thought there would be some smooth, uniform ice surfaces, but Ran revealed an underside marked by huge cracks, ridges. There were formations that looked like sand dunes, frozen in time. And finally, it found some mysterious swirling and teardrop-shaped patterns. They all looked more like art than geology. This actually tells the story of ice shelves and the ocean around it. Warm water sneaks in under the ice and melts it from below. Sometimes it smooths the ice out, but other times it carves out these weird, uneven shapes that look like patterns and drawings. And some of these shapes are huge, over 1,300 feet long. That's about 3.5 football fields. The reason why they look like swirling doodles is because the Earth spins. It makes the water turn in special ways, bending the shapes and drawing these spirals. It's called the Coriolis effect. Imagine you were on a merry-go-round and tried to throw something like a ball. It would go in a curve, not a straight line. Same thing happens with the water on Earth. Later, scientists found similar patterns in other Antarctic ice shelves, though they weren't as epic as the ones under Dotson. But Ran also discovered something horrifying. Turns out that these warm waters, aside from being great artists, are also a huge danger. The Dotson Ice Shelf isn't just hanging out serenely on the sea. It's part of a very delicate system and acts as a protective barrier that holds back huge glaciers in West Antarctica. The ice shelf is floating on the ocean, but it's still connected to the land. As warm water sneaks underneath it and the ice melts, the Dodson can't hold on to the land as tightly anymore. The protective barrier starts to weaken, and this lets the glaciers behind it move faster into the ocean. When those glaciers flow into the sea, they add more water, which could cause sea levels to rise, eventually changing our coastlines. Rand stumbled upon huge pockets where the ice was melting at alarming rates, all due to powerful underwater currents. It was like seeing a ticking clock on the glacier. The stakes were high, but luckily the submarine was ready. This time, it managed to return. And then, it worked for 5 more years, helping scientists with tons of useful data. The missions were daunting. There could be periods where Rand slipped into the pitch-black cavity beneath the glaciers, spending 24 hours without communication. But it was mapping every peak and every valley. It gained experience from over 40 missions below ice. Then, in early 2024, Rand went on a mission to the Thwaites Glacier. The mission was bold from the start. This place is also ominously referred to as the Doomsday Glacier. It's called that because it's slowly melting and has the potential to raise sea levels worldwide if it collapses, causing catastrophes everywhere. That's why Rand was dispatched to explore its underbelly, a place that had never been mapped so intricately before. The idea was to uncover the glacier's secrets, study how rapidly it was melting and why. This was Rand's second time exploring Thwaites. During the previous visit, it became the first sub to ever map the glacier's underside. Rand was exploring the depths from 650 feet to 1,650 feet. It sent a lot of data about how the Doomsday Glacier was slowly melting due to warm ocean currents. But while venturing into these icy depths, something went wrong. Out of nowhere, Rand vanished. Without warning, without a trace. One moment it was sending back crucial data, and the next, it had slipped into the abyss. No distress signals, no final transmission, and it didn't return to the point it was supposed to. People sent extensive searches, helicopters soared overhead, drones buzzed through the frozen skies, but no sign of the submersible emerged from the glacier's grasp. After a while, Rand's batteries would certainly run away. So at this point, it had definitely been swallowed by the abyss beneath 1,500 feet of ice. That was a huge and sad loss for the scientific team. The scientists at the University of Gothenburg are now looking to replace Rand and continue their important research under Thwaites. To this day, scientists have no idea what happened to it. Some say it may have been trapped in the ice. Others believe it was pulled away by an unseen current. It also might have collided with something unexpected. Whatever the truth is, its disappearance has left scientists stunned, and it looks like the ice shelf will hold on to its secrets a little longer. At least we gained a treasure trove of knowledge from Rand's journey. Scientists keep exploring Antarctica, looking for history that hides under the snow. For example, they discovered that around 90 million years ago, a lush temperate rainforest thrived near the South Pole. They revealed an ancient world far warmer than they ever imagined. Deep in Antarctica, they unearthed fossilized roots, pollen, and spores preserved in the soil. All this shows that there was a swampy rainforest that flourished despite months of polar darkness. All these discoveries changed our understanding of Earth's climate, both in the past and the future.
This place has no time zone, no landmass, and the sun rises and sets here just once a year. For over 400 years, since the era of King Henry VIII, thousands of explorers from all over the world were trying to reach this elusive spot, the North Pole. Some were hoping to find a northwest or northeast passage to China and the Indies, and others just wanted to see what it was like. In 1773, the British Royal Navy organized the first scientific expedition to the North Pole. Constantine Phipps volunteered to lead the mission. It was difficult for the two ships to move through thick ice, and they had to be towed using smaller boats. At some point, Phipps was ready to leave the ships as they saw a completely frozen sea. But in the end, they broke free from the ice and escaped into the open sea to return home without reaching the goal. In 1882, American explorer James Booth Lockwood managed to get closer to the goal than anyone else. By that time, at least 750 people in 42 expeditions had lost their lives trying to make it to the pole. On the 7th of September, 1909, the New York Times came out with a sensational front page. Peary discovers the North Pole after 8 trials in 23 years. Robert E. Peary, an American explorer, claimed to have reached the North Pole in April of the same year. But communication back then was slower than now, so the message had only reached New York by September. A week before the famous headline, the New York Herald had published its own front-page sensation. The North Pole is discovered by Dr. Frederick A. Cook. Cook, another American explorer, had vanished into the Arctic for over a year and had everyone convinced he reached the pole in April 1908, a whole year before Peary. It was tricky to provide evidence any of them had actually reached the goal back then. Their goal was constantly moving on sea ice, unlike the South Pole on steady land, so they couldn't just leave a flag or some other proof there. A travel diary full of details of the journey, including daily distances, the position of the stars, and the like, would probably do as evidence. But neither Cook nor Peary were able to provide any of this backup information. So each of them started a campaign to prove they were honest and trustworthy. Peary was mentioned as the North Pole discoverer until 1988. That's when the National Geographic Society revisited the evidence and found that his records really didn't prove his claim. Cook's claim was neither proven nor disproven. Australian-born British explorer Sir Hubert Wilkins went on his first expedition to the North Pole in 1913. That's when he got the idea to reach the goal by submarine. In 1931, he borrowed a special submarine named O-12 from the U.S. Navy. The future mission had 2 goals: to do scientific experiments while floating on ice and moving underwater, and to reach the North Pole by traveling beneath the ice. They planned to study the weather, take temperature measurements, and collect water samples from both the surface and the sea floor. The submarine Sir Hubert used was brought to a shipyard in New Jersey to be modified. They added the latest scientific equipment and changed the outside so the submarine could travel under the ice. On March 16th, the submarine left the shipyard to start its journey to the Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York. But even before leaving the Delaware River, they faced delays. A snowstorm forced them to stop at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and they had to stop again to get more fuel. When the submarine was entering New York Harbor, a crew member who was just 27 years old fell overboard and drowned. The submarine was officially renamed Nautilus, and the grandson of Jules Verne, the author of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which inspired the new name, was there to see it. Before starting their journey, the crew tested the Nautilus in different spots off the New England coast. They faced criticism and were already 2 months behind schedule, so they decided to head straight to England. During their trip across the Atlantic, they sailed into severe storms. On the 13th of June, the starboard engine broke down. Then, the port engine failed because it was overused. While crossing the Atlantic, Sir Hubert Wilkins kept radioing the submarine's position back to the United States. After both engines failed, they sent out an SOS. On June 15th, the USS Wyoming, a huge ship on a training cruise with naval students, reached the Nautilus. The Wyoming towed the broken submarine to Queenstown, Ireland, and then it was taken to Davenport, England for repairs. They had to wait for spare parts from the United States, which caused more delays. Once the Nautilus was fixed, they headed to Bergen, Norway, to meet the submarine science officers and get more equipment. One of the most important additions in Bergen was a diving chamber, which allowed them to lower scientific tools into the water through a special hatch. On August 5th, the Nautilus finally left Bergen and headed north to find ice floes. They had lots of delays because of mechanical problems and storms. One storm even made the submarine tilt at crazy angles. Finally, on August 19th, they saw the first ice floe. For a few days, they followed the ice's edge, looking for a good spot to dive. 3 days later, they tried to dive under the ice, but discovered that the submarine's diving rudders were missing. One diver went overboard to check and saw that someone must have broken off the rudders on purpose. This made Wilkins think that someone on the crew had sabotaged the submarine because they didn't trust the mission. Even without the rudders, Wilkins still wanted to do some of his scientific experiments. On the last day of August, they found a way to force the Nautilus under a 3-foot-thick ice floe. They had to fill the ballast tanks and adjust the trim. They managed to make more dives under this ice this way before the journey ended. After a few more days of trying to do research, Wilkins decided it was too dangerous to stay at sea. The Nautilus arrived at Svalbard, the Norwegian archipelago between mainland Norway and the North Pole, on September 8th, after going through the worst storm of the trip. They planned to go to a port in England, but another storm caused a lot of damage and made the engines fail, so they had to stop in Bergen again. After getting permission from the United States Shipping Board, the Nautilus was towed out of Bergen and sunk in a Norwegian fjord on November 13, 1931. In 1958, a U.S. submarine with the same name, Nautilus, became the first vessel that reached the North Pole by traveling under the ice. This Nautilus was much bigger than the submarines that came before it. It was 319 feet long and weighed 3,590 tons. For comparison, the other Nautilus was 175 feet long. Unlike other submarines, the new Nautilus could stay underwater for a longer time because of its special atomic engine didn't need air and only used a tiny amount of nuclear fuel. On July 23, 1958, it left Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on Operation Sunshine. There were 116 people on board: Commander Anderson, 111 officers and crew, and 4 civilian scientists. The Nautilus traveled north through the Bering Strait and only surfaced once at Point Barrow, Alaska. On August 1st, the submarine left the north coast of Alaska and dove under the Arctic ice cap. The submarine traveled at a depth of 500 feet, with the ice above it between 10 to 50 feet thick. At 11:15 p.m. on August 3rd, Commander Anderson told his crew, "For the world, our country, and the Navy, the North Pole." And the Nautilus went right under the North Pole without stopping. On August 5th, the submarine came up in the Greenland Sea, and then 2 days later, it finished its historic trip in Iceland.
If you draw up a map, trace a line connecting the island of Bermuda, Puerto Rico, Miami, and back to Bermuda, what do you get? The infamous triangle, known for swallowing thousands of ships and aircraft over the centuries. But there's a new mystery to this already enigmatic place. Something's lurking deep in the waters below, and it's leaving bizarre clues of its existence. Splash! Your submarine hits the water surface. You descend 100, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 feet. It's getting darker. The sub's walls creak as the pressure grows. Over 1,400 psi. It's like the weight of a grand piano squeezing every square inch of your body from all sides. You've made it to your destination. All that's left is to spot the beast. Just in time, among the black void, you see a bright green glow off in the distance. It's getting closer. As it approaches, it gets bigger. This is it! The creature that's been leaving strange circular markings on fish, dolphins, whales, and even other sharks. Behold, the cookie cutter shark! Don't let its size fool you. It may be no longer than a bowling pin, but this creature is a parasite. It attaches itself to other marine animals using its neatly arranged serrated teeth. With one bite, it fills its belly, detaches, and goes on about its day. Its mobile snack also swims away with its life. The only evidence of this rendezvous, a cookie-shaped mark on its body. Don't assume you're safe in your submarine. These bold little guys have been known to go after subs too. You decide not to risk the shark punching a hole in the only thing keeping you from being squished to a pulp by the surrounding water. You journey on to meet other bizarre creatures lurking in the Bermuda Triangle. At twice the depth, you'll find the dragonfish. Unlike other deep water inhabitants, these things produce light in the infrared range. Blue and green is what other fish stick to. This gives the dragonfish a huge advantage. It provides itself with light that other marine dwellers just can't perceive. things that want to eat the dragonfish can't detect this light, as well as the critters the dragonfish likes to feed on. A truly unique deep-sea dweller is the vampire squid. Neither vampire nor squid, or octopus, this thing is a unique species of its own. It has the largest eyes compared to body size of any animal on the entire planet. When the vampire squid feels threatened, it curls its arms up and around its body. Essentially, the thing turns itself inside out. Another animal to avoid down here is the terrifying bobbit worm. It buries itself in the seafloor, leaving a small part of its body out. It waits for dinner time with its pincer-like mouth parts open. What's on the menu? Other worms and fish that can be 7 times bigger than the bobbit. It uses its 5 antennas to sense when lunch is close enough to snap. In an instant, the worm launches forward and grabs its lunch with its mouth parts. It's not done yet. Once it's got its jaws locked onto its lunch, the worm injects it with venom and pulls it down into the burrow to feast. One of the deepest trenches in the Bermuda Triangle is the tongue of the ocean. This is also the secret breeding grounds of tiger sharks. You'll instantly recognize them thanks to those darker gray tiger stripes on their sides. They're the second largest predatory shark species after the great white. And with a big size comes a big appetite. Marine mammals, smaller sharks, stingrays, and green turtles are all on the menu. If you ever come face to face with a tiger shark, hopefully not, remember this: you can tell the fish's age by looking at its stripes. They fade over time, so the younger the shark, the more pronounced its stripes. There's plenty of zooplankton in the Bermuda Triangle. These are, usually, small organisms that are essential to the ocean's food chain. But get this, if nothing ate them and they were left to grow out of control, zooplankton would cover the entire world in layers and layers in just 4 months. Oh, and the largest type of zooplankton is the jellyfish. Jellyfish were around long before dinosaurs. You probably know your body is 60% water. A jellyfish is 95%. So if it gets washed onto the shore, after a few hours, most of its body just evaporates into the air. There's also a jellyfish that lives forever. The immortal jellyfish can revert itself back to its polyp stage and then grow again. Sounds like something from another planet, but it's no space jelly. Those do exist, by the way. Back in the 1990s, NASA raised jellyfish in space to see what zero gravity does to them. They were just fine living up there in the cosmos. When they came back down to Earth, though, they had trouble adjusting. The European eel hasn't been to space, but it is quite a globetrotter. It travels all the way from Europe to the Sargasso Sea, where the Bermuda Triangle is located. In the larval stage, it just drifts around the ocean for as long as 3 years sometimes. It's also the chameleon of the sea. Over the years, the European eel changes color, going from translucent to yellow to metallic silver. They're nocturnal and secretive, pretty much the ideal companion to have when you raid the fridge at midnight. A giant squid over half the length of a football field once washed up on a Florida beach. Researchers suspected this behemoth came from the Atlantic Ocean near the Bermuda Triangle. Giant squids are the longest invertebrates, meaning they have no backbone. They also have the biggest eyes on Earth, ever. They're as large as a soccer ball. Another creature found near the Bermuda Triangle is Sterer's cave shrimp. They were so good at keeping to themselves that no one knew these creatures even existed until 2011. Some female cave shrimps carry an impressive number of eggs along with them. Scientists discovered one female had around 2,000 eggs attached to her body. The Bermuda petrel is the national bird of, yes, you guessed it, Bermuda. It's the second rarest seabird on the planet. In fact, people thought it was extinct until 1951, when they spotted a few on the island. It has an eerie cry that'll send shivers down your spine. The Nassau grouper can only be found on the coasts of South Florida. This fish lies in wait and ambushes its lunch of other fish, crabs, and lobsters. It's sort of like a vacuum cleaner because it inhales its food through its huge mouth. The fish has a cool defense mechanism too. Like the chameleon, it changes color when it feels it's in danger. Sometimes it takes on a lighter or darker shade of its own color to blend in with the environment. So, you may spot a Nassau grouper, or you may not. If you happen to visit the Bermuda Triangle, you'll probably see a hammerhead shark. They use that iconic hammer-shaped head to pin their lunch, stingrays, onto the ocean floor. The shape of their head also gives them better vision. They can see almost 360 degrees all around, above and below them. Well, save for one blind spot right in front of their nose. The hawksbill sea turtle may not look intimidating, but this guy will eat anything it can get its bird-like beak around. Sea sponges, algae, and even venomous jellyfish. A lot of the stuff on their menu is inedible for most, but their body fat can absorb the venom and toxins, so they go unscathed. The Bermuda Triangle is also home to green glowworms. They're not really worms, but larvae. They produce that bright light from an organ near their tail. This light makes smaller creatures come toward them, making it easy for them to catch their lunch. Most of the time, they look pretty ordinary, but they have an oddly fixed schedule. Every third night after the full moon during the summer, at an exact time, the glowworm lights up. But back to more nightmarish creatures of the Bermuda Triangle. There's the goblin shark, known as a living fossil because it's the only one left of its animal family. It's only about the length of your forearm and looks like nothing special. But watch closely as its lunch gets too close. Boom! The shark's jaw shoots out of its mouth and grabs onto the unlucky creature. Once the teeth have locked in, the jaw goes right back in the shark's mouth. And yes, you share the planet with this thing.
Nearly 140 years ago, some fishermen pulled pieces of a ship from Lake Michigan. But where was the rest of it? From that moment on, hunters spent years searching for the ghost ship. By the 1970s, the hunt reached a new level. One with a $1,000 reward offered to anyone who could find it. Still, nothing. It was as if the vessel had simply vanished into thin air. That is, until now. Researchers have finally found the shipwreck off the coast of Bailey's Harbor, Wisconsin. The ship called the F.J. King disappeared back in 1886. At that time, this 140-foot-long vessel had a very important job: transporting grain. Now you might think, grain? Really? That's it? Okay, sure, it's not like the ship was loaded with tons of gold or jewels. But we have to see the bigger picture. At that time, Wisconsin was known as America's breadbasket. The state produced huge amounts of food, especially wheat. In fact, about 1/6 of the nation's wheat was being harvested there. Farming was booming, and that of course meant big money. The F.J. King was part of that golden era.
For about 19 years, it successfully carried and traded grain and iron ore through the Welland Canal. That is, until September 15, 1886. That day, the crew were on their journey to carry iron ore from Michigan to Chicago. It was supposed to be just another routine trip, but they were caught in a powerful storm. The conditions were brutal, with waves nearly 10 feet high. The crew fought desperately to get the water out and keep the ship afloat, but the waves were too strong. They kept coming, one after another. The men worked hard until they couldn't go on anymore. The waves were splitting the ship's seams. At this point, a catastrophe was inevitable. So Captain William Griffin gave the order, "Abandon ship." They had no choice but to get out. The men grabbed their belongings as fast as they could and climbed into the ship's small yawl boat. It was 2 in the morning. Everything around them was dark. As they tried to get closer to shore, the F.J. King went down, bow first. And then suddenly, boom! The crew watched in shock as the ship's stern deckhouse blew off, sending the captain's papers 50 feet into the air. They stayed in the small boat until they were picked up by a passing schooner called La Petite. The crew took them to Bailey's Harbor, and moments later, Captain Griffin filed a wreck report. That's when the real mystery began. In his report, the captain said the ship had gone down about 5 miles off the shore of Lake Michigan. But that was just what he thought. I mean, it wasn't based on any instruments, readings, or anything like that. It was just what he remembered from that night. A week later, though, a local lighthouse keeper spotted the masts of a schooner sticking out of the water, much closer to shore. He reported it to a nearby newspaper, and that's when people really started asking questions. Could that be the F.J. King? Even though they had a solid lead, it didn't take them anywhere. No one could find the boat. Days passed, then months, then years, until 2025. That's when an investigator named Brendan Baylod decided enough was enough. He gathered a team of about 20 scientists and historians to finally track down this historic shipwreck. They dug through hundreds of original documents about the ship and the day it went down, piecing together clues and narrowing down the area where it might be. Many experts were like, "Man, just let it go." And to be fair, they had every reason to feel discouraged. After all, that whole area had already been searched over and over. There was just no way the ship could still be out there. But Bayod didn't give up. Okay, truth is, he also thought it was a long shot. But working to find the ghost ship had other perks. His team wanted to get some hands-on experience with a brand new super advanced sonar. With that in mind, they set out on their mission, heading to Lake Michigan on June 28th. Okay, great. But where do you even start? First, Bayod had to clear something up. Back when the wreck happened, who was actually telling the truth about the ship's location? The captain or the lighthouse keeper? Getting that answer would point them in the right direction. Then, Bayod thought about something that might have already crossed your mind. How could the captain really know where they were? It was pitch black. He'd just been struggling to keep his ship afloat. He couldn't see much. He was exhausted and probably hungry. He definitely wasn't thinking straight. That's when the investigator realized the lighthouse keeper's directions were probably more accurate. Thankfully, he found the newspaper article from 1886. You know, the one I mentioned earlier, where the lighthouse keeper gave a more specific detail about where he'd last seen the ship's masts. What the investigator did next was draw a 2-square-mile grid around that location, and the team decided to map the lake bottom inside that grid using their fancy tech. So, there they were, aboard the Shoreline, a tour boat that usually carries sightseers along the peninsula. But that day, they didn't really expect to find anything. Their only goal that afternoon was to test their new side-scan sonar, one with much greater capability than the previous model the crew had been using. But then, after about 2 hours of searching, something strange happened. The sonar was sending out sound waves to map the dark floor of Lake Michigan when it started to act a little differently. And as the images began to stitch together, they revealed a shape that was impossible to mistake. A ship. Bingo. They'd found it. Turns out the wreck was less than half a mile from where the lighthouse keeper had said it would be. At this point, some of the crew had to pinch each other. They couldn't believe their eyes. They were shocked, not only because they'd found the ship so quickly, but also because of how well it was preserved. You see, the investigators were hopeful, but they also thought the ship would be shattered into pieces. After all, it had been carrying iron ore, and the weight of all that metal could have torn it apart even more. But no. To everyone's surprise, the hull was almost completely intact. Sure, the front right side was crushed, but the rest of it was pretty much there. The investigators even found the crew's belongings and kitchenware scattered across the lake bottom. Once they got over the shock, they called in archaeologists to examine the site and create a 3-dimensional model of the wreck. This is the 5th major shipwreck Bayod and his team have found in the last 3 years, but the truth is, this region is full of mysteries still waiting to be uncovered. The F.J. King is just one of around 6,000 ships that were damaged or destroyed in incidents across the Great Lakes during the 1800s. And it's estimated that hundreds of these wrecks still remain hidden at the bottom of Lakes Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. Thankfully, discoveries like this one could become more and more common. In fact, more shipwrecks are being found today than at any other time in history. Advances in technology have made scanning the lake floor less expensive and more accessible, not just for professionals, but for amateurs too. And the profile of these modern-day shipwreck hunters has changed. Now, they're more often searching for wrecks for their historical value, not just to find treasure. Another project that could help uncover even more wrecks in the Great Lakes is called Lakebed 2030. It could change everything, as its goal is to map the entire lake floor. And right now, only about 15% has been explored. That means the Great Lakes might still be hiding their biggest secrets, and that, at the very least, is super exciting.
For years, the world's most valuable shipwreck was just a legend, until now. It has finally been found, and among the wreckage was a real treasure worth $1.1 billion. To understand this better, we need to go back to 1622. That year, the mighty Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora de Atocha set sail from Havana, packed with riches belonging both to King Philip IV of Spain and to the wealthy members of the crew. We're talking about gold, silver, copper, and emeralds from Colombia, Peru, Mexico, and Venezuela. The cargo was so large, totaling more than 40 tons, and so vast that it took 2 months to transport it to the ship. The ship was also packed with people. There were 265 people on board. At first, everything went well, but then came the Florida Straits and trouble. The crew found themselves lost in the night that was not only cold, but also stormy. And before long, they were facing a powerful hurricane. The wind tore the masts apart. Giant waves destroyed the rudder, and soon, the Atocha was sinking toward the darkness of the seabed. The disaster that night meant a huge loss of wealth for King Philip IV, but even worse was the loss of life. Of the original 265 crew members, only 5 survived. They managed to climb up the mizzen of the ship, the only part that remained above water. With all that treasure gone, the Spanish were quick to spring into action and devised a salvage operation. 5 ships were sent to recover the cargo. The plan seemed simple and easy. After all, the hatches were securely locked, so the treasure could still be there. But almost immediately, things went wrong. For example, one of the 5 ships ran aground before it could even begin its journey. In the end, the search dragged on for 60 years, and many factors contributed to the mission's failure. That may not seem so bad today, but back then, divers didn't have the technology or safety equipment that we have today. Exploring the seabed was risky, and more often than not, it led nowhere. While searching for the Atocha, the rescuers found traces of another vessel, the Santa Margarita, the Atocha's sister ship. Another hurricane passed through the region a month after the sinking. The seabed became a jigsaw puzzle with pieces of the ship scattered everywhere. The rescue mission became almost impossible. Over time, the Spanish managed to recover part of the Santa Margarita's cargo, but Atocha's treasure seemed lost forever. Even so, no one forgot that story. Then in 1969, more than 300 years after the sinking, everything began to change. An experienced deep-sea diver, Mel Fisher, stepped in and decided to rewrite history. Mel had already spent a big part of his life at the bottom of the sea. He and his wife even ran a diving school in California. So, Mel gathered his family and moved to the other side of the country. He led a new team of hunters whose mission was clear: to find the lost treasure of the legendary Atocha. They had little more than a boat, some diving equipment, and metal detectors, but that was enough to get them started. They focused on a region called the Matacumbe Keys, mentioned in several 17th century documents. In the first year, they traveled more than 100,000 miles but found absolutely nothing. It seemed like an impossible dream. But Mel still had a card up his sleeve: Eugene Lyon, a historian who would change the course of the search. Eugene delved into the Spanish archives in search of clues about the shipwreck. It was there that he found an important document that mentioned a group of people trying to save it. On the last page, it was mentioned that an area 100 miles from where Mel was searching had been the scene of the main exploration. This little piece of information was the needle in the haystack they needed. They rerouted the ship and soon arrived at the new location. But there was a challenge. That part of the ocean was deeper and the visibility there was almost zero. It was difficult to see your own hands. However, Mel knew how to deal with the adversities of diving and came up with a simple and brilliant solution. He installed 2 large tubes on the boat called letterboxes. Those tubes could be lowered in front of the propellers. The idea was ingenious. They sucked clean water from the surface and directed it to the bottom of the sea, exactly where the divers were. This technique not only cleared the murky water, but also helped to reveal objects that had been hidden for centuries. And still, the search took 16 years. During that time, Fisher found many lost items. Then, in 1971, they discovered a huge anchor. This was the first clue that they were close to finding the Atocha. In the following days, more objects appeared. Cups, swords, and ancient nails turned up. To keep everything organized, the team created a circular map. On it, they marked the exact location of each item they found. They also used radio transmitters on land and a receiver on the boat, which allowed them to know precisely where they were. The system was so efficient that it could measure the position with a margin of error of just 1 foot. Over time, a line began to form on the map, pointing to where the Atocha's main treasure might be hidden. They followed this trail for 2 years. Just when they were starting to lose hope, they found silver bars. It was the year 1973. This opened the door to much bigger discoveries. The silver alone was worth over $100,000, but the real treasure was yet to come. On July 20th, 1985, valuables that would be worth around $1.1 billion today were finally discovered in the main hull of the ship. The treasure included 180,000 silver coins, 24 tons of silver bars, 125 gold bars, a collection of pearls, and 66 pounds of emeralds. Some of these finds were priceless, not only because they were rare, but because of their history. The Atocha Cross, the Royal Orb, and the Atocha Ring, 3 royal artifacts, were found in near-perfect condition. The Atocha Cross was the most valuable of all the artifacts. It had 9 brilliant green emeralds set in 22-karat gold. A true treasure from the past, shining once again after centuries underwater. Soon after the discovery, the state of Florida thought, wait a second, we want a piece of that treasure. They went to court, demanding a whopping 25% of the value. A bitter legal battle ensued and it lasted 8 years. It even went all the way to the Supreme Court. But in the end, treasure hunter Mel emerged victorious. He was even invited to The Tonight Show, showing off a massive gold chain found in the wreckage, wrapped around his waist like a belt. People called it the money chain, and for good reason. The find was so big that the wreck was declared the world's most valuable by the Guinness Book of Records in 2014. After the initial excitement, Mel sold some of the gems, but the bulk of the treasure remained in the family for a while. What was left was auctioned off. No one knows exactly how much the jewels were sold for, but one thing is for sure. Their value has skyrocketed over the years, and it's not just about the sparkle, it's about the legend that lives behind them. Today, these treasures are part of the particular Museo collection, the largest private collection of the Atocha artifacts in the world. And no, they're not for sale. But the good news is that you can still see them. They're on display, shining brightly in homage to Colombia's rich history and the famous mine from which they came. The people behind them say that these emeralds are as iconic as the rubies of Mogok or the sapphires of Kashmir. And honestly, they're right.
On a fine summer night of August 30th, 1892, a shipping magnate took his family for a cruise on Lake Superior. They were traveling on the Western Reserve, which was supposed to be one of the safest ships of its day. It was made of a type of steel like that used to construct the infamous Titanic, and it ended up with a similar tragic destiny. The ship broke in two, and was found only 132 years later in 2024. The 300-foot steamship was the first steel-plated freighter on the Great Lakes. One newspaper called it the Inland Greyhound because of how quickly it cut through the water. Peter H. Minch was the owner and inventor of this vehicle, which had been built just 2 years earlier in Cleveland. On the night of its last voyage, the ship set off toward Two Harbors, Minnesota. Minch brought along 5 of his family members: his wife, their 2 kids, his sister-in-law, and his niece. There were also 22 crew members aboard. It was a pleasant and smooth ride while they were sailing across Lake Huron. But as soon as they left Whitefish Bay, the lake turned wild, and the crew had to drop anchor for a while. Later that evening, as they entered Lake Superior around 9 p.m., a fierce summer storm moved in with powerful winds and crashing waves. Then disaster. The ship began to split in two. Within just 10 minutes, the Western Reserve was completely underwater. Everyone managed to get into lifeboats. The Minch family, with some crew members, took the wooden one, and the remaining 10 people got into the metal one. But the storm was so brutal that the metal boats sank right away, and only a few made it into the other lifeboat. That second boat floated for the next 10 hours. A steamship passed by, but didn't notice or hear the people calling for help. Around 7 o'clock the next morning, the lifeboat got within a mile of shore near Deer Park, Michigan. They were so close to safety, but sadly, the lifeboat flipped too, and they all ended up in the freezing water. The only survivor of this tragedy was 24-year-old Harry Stewart, the ship's wheelsman. He swam a full mile through the freezing water and made it to shore, almost unconscious but alive. He later mentioned he survived only thanks to a heavy-knit, close-fitting pea jacket. The Western Reserve was lost for over 100 years until a couple of determined explorers finally tracked it down. They spent over 2 years searching non-stop for the wreck off Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Daryl and Dan Erdl found it using a side-scan sonar that looks half a mile out on each side. One day, they saw a tiny blip on the left side of the scan. It was small, but Daryl measured the shadow, noticed that it was about 40 feet tall, and realized it must be something important. So they turned back and scanned directly over the spot. They saw cargo hatches and the wreck that looked like the ship had snapped in two, with one half lying on top of the other in an almost impossible position. Each piece measured around 150 feet long, and once they checked the width, they knew for sure that they had just found the legendary Western Reserve. Historians are still not sure why the vessel, that was supposed to be unsinkable, suddenly snapped in half, but they have a few solid theories. One idea is something called hogging. It happens when the ship rides up over a giant wave and the bow and stern are left hanging in the air with nothing underneath to support them. That puts a large amount of pressure on the middle, and it bends down like a stick when you're pulling both ends. Another plausible reason concerns the steel the vessel was made of. Back then, steel was the hot new substitute for iron. But quality control wasn't perfect. Some steel plates weren't made very well, which could have caused a serious weak point in the ship's body. There's also the chance that the ship didn't have enough ballast, which is the weight used to keep it stable, or maybe it wasn't balanced correctly. Sadly, just 8 weeks after the Western Reserve tragedy, another vessel that had been built at the same time with similar mill runs of steel plate repeated the destiny of its twin. The W.H. Gilcher was a steam freighter used to transport cargo between ports on the Great Lakes. It set out on what was supposed to be a routine trip on October 26, 1892. Loaded with over 3,000 tons of coal, the ship left Buffalo heading for Milwaukee. Captain Leeds H. Weeks and a crew of 18 were on board. Everything seemed normal at first, and by the afternoon of October 28th, the ship passed through the Straits of Mackinac and entered Lake Michigan. It was expected to reach Milwaukee by the 30th, but it never made it. A massive storm slammed into Lake Michigan and Lake Huron on October 28th and 29th. and created havoc on travel plans for many, many ships. When the storm finally passed and boats started pulling into port, people began to piece together what happened to the W.H. Gilcher. One captain who was sailing nearby on his schooner said he saw a large steamer battling the storm about 20 miles northwest of North Manitou Island around 8 p.m. on the 28th. The ship looked helpless, and there was no movement or sign of life. Another captain later saw furniture and parts of the ship's bridge floating in the lake near South Manitou Island. Then 2 more steamers picked up broken pieces of W.H. Gilcher's pilot house in the same area. It became clear that the storm had destroyed the freighter, and tragically, no one survived. The Great Lakes are a hot spot for shipwrecks, and there have been between 6,000 to 10,000 of those starting in the 17th century. Back in 1679, the Griffon became the first European vessel to vanish without a trace on the lakes. It sailed all the way from Buffalo, New York, to Green Bay, Wisconsin, passing through Lake Erie, the Detroit River, Lake St. Clair, and Lake Huron before reaching Lake Michigan. After a stop in Green Bay, it started heading back, and then it was never seen again. In 1975, one of the most famous shipwrecks happened when the massive 729-foot ore carrier SS Edmund Fitzgerald sank in Lake Superior. A fall storm was supposed to stay far south of their route, but things changed fast. Another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, was following behind and kept in radio contact with the Fitz's captain, Ernest McSorley. By the afternoon of November 10th, waves were smashing over the deck, and wind gusts at over 80 miles per hour were hitting both ships hard. By 7:20 p.m., the Anderson couldn't reach the Fitzgerald by radio anymore, and it had vanished from radar. There was no distress call, no warning. The huge ship had just disappeared. Later, search crews found the wreck over 530 feet under the surface, broken into 2 giant pieces. No one of the 29 crew members survived, and no one witnessed what really happened. There could be all sorts of reasons for such tragedies, from errors in judgment and equipment failure to simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Great Lakes are massive bodies of water with weather systems that you would expect to find in seas. These inland seas sit deep in the middle of the continent, and hurricane-strength winds and powerful storms form here. Many of them hit in November and December, when the waters are still warm from the summer, but Canadian cold air is starting to push down. There's a huge difference in temperature between the air and water. This difference and strong winds lead to massive waves. Plus, ice forms more easily in fresh water than in salt water. It builds up on ships quickly, and crew members also have to get around tricky ice waters. Water levels here are also unstable. In wet years, storms are more likely to happen, and this makes the risk of damage or disaster higher.
360 years ago, a massive British ship, the London, blew up in the Thames estuary. The tragedy took over 300 lives, including the sailors and their loved ones. No one knows exactly what led to all this, but scientists are finally getting close to the truth. Divers accidentally found an exceptionally well-preserved bronze cannon from the ship. This cannon, that was buried in silt and clay for centuries, could have all the answers. The London was a service ship built for the Navy of the Commonwealth of England. It set off on its first journey in June 1656. The ship played a huge role in British history as it was part of a convoy that went to the Netherlands in 1660 to collect Charles II and restore him to the throne. 5 years later, in March 1665, it was traveling from Chatham to Hope. From there, the Admiral Sir John Lawson was supposed to take it to the sea. But just before reaching the buoy of the Knower, the gunpowder suddenly blew up on the ship. About 25 people who were in the roundhouse and coach survived, but over 300 drowned. The ship broke into 2 pieces. Henry Bennett, the Earl of Arlington, passed along rumors that it all happened because of cheap, low-quality gunpowder that was on the ship. When experts of that time inspected the shipwreck, they concluded that the cannons could still be salvaged, but the ship itself was a total loss. Later, when someone recovered some of them in 1679, there was a scandal where they tried to use them to settle a completely unrelated debt. In 2005, divers rediscovered the London. To protect it, port authorities even had to move the shipping lane, and a team of archaeologists got to work exploring it. That wreck is a big deal because it gives us real insights into English naval history. Visibility in the Thames estuary can be terrible. Sometimes you can't even see 1.5 feet in front of you. Working on the site is also super tough because it's in a crazy tidal environment, and a busy shipping lane, where huge cargo ships constantly pass by, is still near. So when a cannon suddenly appeared, stuck deep in the clay, it meant the conditions had to be absolutely perfect. Experts believe the find is from the Commonwealth era, and it's medium size, about 8 feet 6 inches long. It was part of a special set made specifically for the London and was placed on the ship's lower deck. Every single gun carriage on the London was one of a kind because all of its cannons came from different countries and different periods in naval history. Big cannons were really rare and crazy expensive to make since they needed tons of bronze or iron and had to be individually cast. That's why the Navy often grabbed cannons from captured rival ships, old shipwrecks, or decommissioned vessels. The new find is one of the clues that could eventually help scientists to solve the mystery of the London tragedy. So far, they've also found leather shoes, pieces of instruments, wooden tools, rope, and a compass. All these artifacts are like puzzle pieces to them. They still don't have enough evidence to be sure, but it looks like both the pipe and candles could have been sources of flames that set off a larger bang. Some workers made another amazing find at a flooded quarry in nearby southeast England, about 60 miles southeast of London. They stumbled upon the remains of a rare Elizabethan-era ship hundreds of yards away from the nearest coastline. Finding a ship from the late 1500s is a huge deal, because very few vessels from that time have survived. Studying it could help scientists answer some big questions about an important era in history, when England was becoming a major player in European trade. Today, the quarry site is about 1,000 feet from the sea, but back in the 1500s, it was actually part of the coastline. Archaeologists think the ship either wrecked on a rocky headland or someone dumped it there when it was too damaged to sail anymore. Scientists haven't identified it yet, but they studied over 100 pieces of its wooden hull, reading the tree rings, and found that it was built from English oak trees cut down between 1558 and 1580. At that time, Northern Europe was switching from the old clinker method where the planks overlapped like fish scales to the carvel style from the Mediterranean, where the planks are smooth and flush against each other, nailed to an internal frame. Old wood usually rots away pretty fast when it's exposed to air or water. But if it's buried under a thick, oxygen-free layer of mud or silt, it can survive for centuries. That's exactly what happened here. The team is using laser scanning and digital photography to document everything about the wreck. Once they finish their research, they plan to rebury the timbers under the silt in the Quarry Lake, so the ship can stay there safe for many more centuries to come. A team of archaeologists in Norway found a ship in an even more unexpected location, in a flat field. There's a hill nearby called Gel Mound. It's actually a huge burial monument that the Vikings themselves had built. The farmer who owns the field wanted to dig some drainage ditches, but first, he needed experts to check for anything important underground. Archaeologists used a high-resolution georadar attached to a tractor-like vehicle. When they scanned the field, they discovered that it used to be packed with burial mounds, at least 8 new ones nobody had ever found before. And beneath one of the mounds, the radar picked up the outline of a ship. Back in Viking times, ships were super valuable, so they only buried them with really important people. Scientists have only found 3 boat burials in all of Norway before, and this is the first new one in years. The team believes this ship is from Viking times, probably between the years 500 and 1000 CE. Because the burial mound above it got flat over time, the ship is now only about 1.6 feet below the ground. That's super close to the surface. It's around 66 feet long, and the radar showed that parts like the keel and the floorboards are still preserved. The archaeologists plan to explore more using non-invasive tools so they don't wreck anything by accident. If they need to, they'll start an excavation. Far away from Norway in the Namibian desert, a miner looking for gems accidentally found a legendary shipwreck almost 500 years old. The workers called in an archaeologist to check it out, and they thought it must have been the remains of a Portuguese trading ship, the Bom Jesus, that had mysteriously vanished in the 1500s. The Bom Jesus had left Lisbon loaded with treasures, aiming for India. But somewhere along the southern tip of Africa, a brutal storm slammed it into the Namibian coast. The ship smashed into rocks, broke apart, and disappeared under the waves. When archaeologists explored the wreck, they found parts of the ship scattered across the shore and buried under thick sand, which actually saved the remains from rotting away. They even discovered treasure, over 40 tons of cargo that had spilled out of the captain's chest underwater when the hull broke. There were cannons, swords, fabrics, tools sailors used to navigate by the stars, and most impressive of all, 1,845 copper ingots, solid pieces of metal weighing 16 to 17 tons in total. Scientists could even read the old trademarks stamped on them, revealing they were made by a mega-rich German trading company. And then there was the real jackpot. More than 2,000 gold and silver coins from all over the world, Portugal, Venice, France, and the Moorish states, plus 105 giant elephant tusks weighing about 2 tons. The tusks were likely on their way to become luxury goods like jewelry and fine carvings. DNA tests later showed the ivory came from West African forest and savanna elephants. They didn't find many bones though, which means the crew either managed to escape or were lost forever at sea. A ship filled with gold and other treasures worth over $13 million was found in the middle of the Namibian desert after almost 500 years. The worker who found it was actually looking for diamonds, but ended up with something way more valuable for history. There were some blocks of copper, some wood, pipes, and elephant tusks. The miners called for an archaeologist, who soon realized it wasn't a disturbed beach like they thought, but a shipwreck. All evidence showed that it was a Portuguese trading vessel, Bom Jesus, that went missing in the 16th century. Experts believe it was a special kind of ship that was bigger, stronger, and better than older ships from Portugal and Spain. These ships were built to take Portuguese explorers on long trips to distant places like India, China, and Japan, and come back with tons of cargo. The Bom Jesus was likely carrying treasures from Lisbon, Portugal, to Western India. But it looks like on its way around the southern tip of Africa, near Namibia, a big storm pushed the ship too close to the shore. The ship hit a rock, tipped over, and broke apart, sinking into the ocean. Archaeologists found treasure from the captain's chest under the water, which probably fell out when the ship's wooden hull broke. They also found pieces of the ship scattered along the shore, likely from the violent storm and later by construction in the area. The storm must have been very fierce, but they didn't find many bones, which means most of the crew may have survived or were lost at sea. The ship was split into 3 sections and incredibly well preserved, thanks to the thick layers of sand that covered it and prevented rot. Archaeologists who studied the wreck discovered over 40 tons of cargo. There were cannons, swords, blocks of metal like lead and tin, fabrics, and tools that sailors used to navigate the stars while traveling across the ocean. The most exciting discovery was 1,845 copper ingots, weighing as much as 16 to 17 tons altogether. Those copper ingots, or pieces of pure metal, are still in great condition because the hull of the ship and layers of sand protected them from ocean water. The scientists even managed to read the trademarks on them on site and learned they were made by a super wealthy German trading company. There were also more than 2,000 shiny gold and silver coins from different countries, and 105 enormous elephant tusks weighing about 2 tons. The tusks were likely supposed to become luxury items, like jewelry or carvings at the destination. Archaeologists took some DNA samples from the tusks and found that they came from West African forests and savanna elephants. Researchers were lucky that the ship was found in a restricted diamond mining area. No scavengers were able to get their hands on the treasures. The Bom Jesus remains the oldest and most valuable shipwreck that was ever discovered off the western coast of sub-Saharan Africa. Another shipwreck recently found by accident was buried under a 10-foot tall sand dune near the Caspian Sea. Some people call it the world's largest lake, and it has water levels that rise and fall over time because of the changes in weather patterns. These changes can move sand and uncover things like this shipwreck and other treasures along the coast. As the dune slowly disappeared, the ship started to show. Before digging it out, scientists worried that waves from the sea might damage the wreck. To protect it, they built a wall using thousands of sandbags to keep the waves away. When the ship was uncovered, they discovered it was a 3-masted, 92-foot-long merchant ship with a strong double hull. Wood samples showed the ship was built in the 18th to 19th century using trees like Scots pine, spruce, and larch from the Volga River area or the Caucasus. They even found buckwheat and plants from the same region, which were probably traded or used to feed the sailors. It proves that the ship was part of a group of merchant ships that once sailed the Caspian Sea. An amateur fisherman who was 20 feet under the sea off the coast of Turkey noticed some huge metal remains. He had an underwater camera, so he made footage of the discovery and took it to scientists. They immediately started an investigation and learned that it must be a shipwreck from the first decades of the 20th century. It could be one of the Ottoman Empire ships that had an important mission to deliver supplies, but disappeared without a trace. Scientists got permission to study this Black Sea wreck in detail to learn more about its mysteries. They're hoping to find its shipyard documents to find some answers, as the ship itself is in terrible condition and is tricky to work with. Robot submersibles that belong to an oil and gas company noticed hundreds of intact ancient storage jars sitting on the seabed in the eastern Mediterranean. Experts think those jars are 3,300 years old. This makes the find the oldest shipwreck from the deep sea. The jugs were probably used to store oil or other agricultural products like fruit. This proves that the people who made them organized maritime trade and had incredible navigational skills. It looks like the ancient mariners managed to traverse the Mediterranean Sea without a line of sight to any coast. All they could see was the horizon, so they must have used the sun and other stars to find their way. Off the coast of Sicily, under 20 feet of sand and rock, archaeologists found a shipwreck so old that they aren't even sure what materials were used to build it. They think the ship is from the 5th or 6th century BCE, which means it's over 2,500 years old. This ancient ship wasn't alone. Researchers also found 2 iron anchors shaped like an upside-down T from around the 7th century of the Common Era, and 4 stone anchors from prehistoric times nearby. One of the stone anchors was broken and may have had wooden pieces attached to help it hold on to the seafloor. They figured out that the ship itself was built using the on-shell technique. The wooden planks of the ship were connected so tightly that they could support the ship on their own, with extra beams added just to make it stronger. Sadly, the ship's wooden hull is very fragile now because tiny sea creatures that eat wood have damaged it over the years. Scientists are being extra careful as they study it to make sure it doesn't fall apart. This discovery is such a big deal because it was built during a time when Sicily was super important for trade. Back then, the Greeks and Punics were trying to take control of the seas long before Rome became the ruler of the Mediterranean. By studying this ship, Scientists hope to learn more about how people traveled and traded in those ancient times. One more shipwreck, this time off the coast of Kenya. Could be from Vasco da Gama's final voyage. This Portuguese explorer was the first European to reach India by sea around the Cape of Good Hope. Local fishermen discovered the shipwreck in question in 2013. When an underwater archaeologist came to check it out, he found some treasures at the spot: elephant tusks and valuable copper ingots. If this find really has to do with Vasco da Gama, then it must be from the 16th century. It was the year of his third and final voyage to India. Da Gama led a huge fleet of 20 ships, one of which was the São Jorge. Most of the ship is hidden under layers of coral, and a whole team of scientists are carefully digging trenches to find parts of the ship's wooden frame and hull. A Portuguese archaeologist just discovered a bunch of sunken ships filled with gold, including a Spanish galleon with 22 tons of gold and silver. This much gold today is worth about $2 billion, and this is the money from one ship alone. Archaeologist Alexandre Monteiro made this discovery almost by accident. He was studying some documents when he found some information about a ship that went missing in 1615, and he decided he wanted to find it. After many years, Alexandre found not just this specific ship. He actually discovered 8,620 shipwrecks in the waters of Portugal alone. Out of this number, 250 are gold-filled shipwrecks, a discovery that would make any Jack Sparrow shake in his boots. Most of these ships went down for boring reasons like the weather, but sometimes they were destroyed in battles, which may or may not have been super epic. They were carrying gold and other treasures from the New World to Europe. And of course, everyone wanted a share. Alexandre had been studying historical shipwrecks for 30 years now, so he has discovered many ships that went down in somewhat glorious ways. In 1816, for example, a ship of one of the richest men in Portugal sank in Australia with an insane amount of 66,000 silver coins. This was the first ship from Portugal to ever plunge in the waters of Australia. The bad news is that these ancient sunken vessels, filled with riches and epic stories, are not so easy to reach. They're deep down in the ocean and covered by sand. You could still try, but that would be stealing part of a country's history, and you wouldn't want to be that person, would you? Naturally, Portugal was not the only country that explored the seas back then. The coast of Europe is packed with sunken ships filled with gold. In fact, there are about 1 million historical shipwrecks underwater right now, and the treasures abandoned under the sea might be worth around $60 billion. It's an insane amount of money, but let me tell you that these gold-filled sunken ships aren't really worth the hassle. There are many stories of maritime treasure discoveries that turned into insane lawsuits and even long jail time. Our first story starts in 1746, when a violent storm crashed a ship called Prince de Conti near an island in Brittany. The ship was filled with tea, ceramics, and 100 gold ingots. Of course, the owners of the ship tried to save the loot, but if it's not easy now, imagine how it was back in the 18th century. It took more than 200 years for the vessel to be found. It finally happened in 1975, when a group of French men discovered it and decided to take pretty much every valuable thing they could find. Now, I said these things were not worth the trouble for a reason. In France, if you find anything that can be historical, you must declare it to the local authorities within 48 hours. Fail to comply, and you will be committing something known as a crime. To be fair, our French friends here did declare their findings, but only the corroded cannons from the ship. And the gold? Well, they sold it. Obviously, because each gold bar is worth between $125,000 to $231,000. It took French authorities almost 50 years to retrieve the stolen gold, and they didn't retrieve all of it. Part of it was bought by an elderly couple living in Florida, and the crime is so serious they were charged for connection with money laundering organized crime, and the trafficking of cultural goods. The poachers also sold some gold ingots to the British Museum collection. Now, let's go back to the 1850s, when a steamer called SS Central America traveled from Panama to California and back again. This was during the Californian Gold Rush, a time when 300,000 people moved to California to dig for gold. Because the travel route was not easy breezy, people needed to carry their gold around on big ships. This is where our friend SS Central America comes in. In 1857, the ship had 578 people on board and about 10 tons of gold. Very few survived, and around $100 to $150 million in gold went down with the ship. All of this explains why in 1988, a group of investors from Columbus decided to finance a research project to find this ship. The research was led by a guy named Tommy Thompson. Tommy was really crazy about the idea of finding this sunken ship filled with gold. It took him years to find the exact location of the SS Central America, especially because the ship was 7,500 feet beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, and retrieving it required a lot of fancy tech. A group of 161 investors paid for his adventure, but it goes without saying that they were not doing this out of love from their hearts. They invested $12.5 million in this project because they were expecting to earn at least 10 times more. But since life is not all sunshine and rainbows, 39 insurance companies sued the research team as soon as they retrieved the gold. Back when the ship was up and running, these companies insured the cargo of the SS Central America, and when the cargo was finally retrieved, more than 100 years later, they wanted to be compensated. They said it was not their job to retrieve it, but that doesn't mean they abandoned it. This crazy talk didn't stick, and 92% of the gold was given to the research team. The plot thickened when the investors were scammed by none other than Tommy Thompson, who fled with $4.16 million. He also had 500 gold coins, but he's not telling a soul where they are. Nonsense like this is the reason why most countries have rules to protect cultural properties. And yes, sometimes shipwrecks can be a cultural property. Obviously, there are many maritime treasure discoveries that happen without breaking any laws. The SS City of Cairo, for example, was a steamship that submerged in 1929 with 2,000 boxes of silver coins weighing 122 tons. A company called Deep Ocean Search retrieved the coins from a depth of 17,000 feet, which is 4,500 feet lower than the Titanic. 34 million pounds went to the UK Treasury, and the Deep Ocean Search also got a share. The good news here is that some of the coins can be bought by collectors, legally. Paying for a treasure is probably the closest you can get to an underwater archaeology find. I know, all I did was destroy your piracy dreams. But while raiding gold-filled shipwrecks may be a crime in most countries, or just financially impossible for us mere mortals, not all hope is lost. There is about $771 trillion worth of gold lying on the ocean floor, and it doesn't have an owner. It's like an underwater gold mine, except the gold is in the water. You know how the water of the ocean is salty? Well, the gold gets mixed with the minerals in the water, so it's not like you stumble upon a gold nugget on the beach. Each liter of ocean water has 13 billionths of a gram of gold, and it's very difficult to extract such tiny particles of gold from the water. But that doesn't mean people haven't tried, and, of course, there's been a scam here too. In the 1890s, a guy claimed he had invented a thing that would suck gold from the seawater. When he got enough money, he fled the country with the cash. If you really want to get some gold, you could try to extract it from the Earth's core, which has 1.6 quadrillion tons of gold. There's 16 times more gold in the Earth's core than what humans have mined in the whole of history. No hoax involved here, because nobody has dared to go down there yet. With archaeologists discovering gold-filled sunken ships out and about, maybe we can make our own maritime treasure discoveries. or at least save enough money to buy some silver coins. In some regions of the Pacific Ocean, ships sink very easily, which is why it is feared by many sailors. Although there are many routes in that area, there are some that few dare to risk because crossing them can mean facing extremely dangerous forces of nature. If you need to travel from Asia to America by ship, the most obvious route would be the shortest and quickest. That is, a nearly straight line under the North Pacific Ocean. But instead, it might be better to avoid crossing this place and opt for longer and more expensive, but much safer routes. There is not one, but several reasons. The Pacific is home to some of the most dangerous waters in the world. When we open a world map, we usually see that the Pacific Ocean is kinda divided, which prevents us from realizing how big it is. But in reality, this giant covers almost a third of Earth's surface. It's about 10 times larger than the smallest ocean in the world, the Arctic Ocean. In other words, when crossing it, the chances of being cut off from any landmass are very high. And in cases of emergencies, mechanical failures, or even storms, help might take days or even weeks to arrive. This significantly increases the risk of serious accidents, the possibility of cargo loss, and, in more serious cases, something even worse. Now think about it. A ship journey from Santos, Brazil to Cape Town, South Africa covers a little more than 3,400 miles. To get from Callao, Peru to Shanghai, China, you need to travel around 10,000 miles. Another major problem that prevents sailors from crossing the Pacific is storm systems, whose name already indicates what they contain: unpredictable and therefore dangerous storms. In addition, near the equator, there is a chain of winds called trade winds that directly influence the climate in the tropical region and occasionally cause rain. Trade winds are strong and constant winds that act like a whirlwind that rotates without stopping. And although they are extremely important for nature, as they spread moisture through forests and even influence the formation of deserts, they pose a problem. Their intensity changes depending on the season. In winter, for example, they can be much stronger. And since these winds are responsible for moving the ocean waters, they also create strong sea currents that could make the journey much more dangerous. In 2015, researchers came across a series of extremely strong winter trade winds that caused a surge of short but intense waves in the Pacific Ocean. They observed that those waves began to hit the ship with constant force, as if they were repeatedly punching it. As a result, the hull structure was completely twisted and deformed. And in the end, they confirmed what they had already known. Those waves, caused by winter trade winds, could be a real threat to vessels. And by the way, do you remember that help in the middle of the Pacific can take a considerable amount of time to arrive? So, now there is much more than one reason behind the hostility of the winds. Such a large ocean doesn't have many geographical barriers, such as mountains or large islands. It means that there are no land structures around it that could hold back or slow down the winds and currents. So the trade winds and ocean currents have complete freedom to gain strength and speed. This explains why the Pacific is the scene of powerful storms and giant waves. This is different, for example, from the North Atlantic, where North America, Europe, and Africa help to contain and redirect the atmospheric and maritime systems. It is now very common for scientists to see the bottom of the Pacific Ocean as a giant jigsaw puzzle because it's literally full of moving pieces. It's home to the largest number of tectonic plates on the planet, and one of them, the Pacific Plate, is the largest maritime plate that science has ever identified. This particularity makes the region extremely unstable to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Even though the ocean may seem calm at first glance due to its geology, things can change very quickly. This makes it unpredictable and treacherous. For example, in 2022, The cargo ship 1 Apis was crossing the ocean, 1,600 miles northwest of Hawaii, when it was caught in a torrential storm. As a result, more than 1,800 containers were damaged, falling to the bottom of the sea. Hundreds more collapsed on the deck, turning into a real-life steel domino due to the force of the wind. The captain managed to steer the ship to Japan. The journey lasted about a week, and it was only when they got there that they understood the extent of the loss. But it wasn't just the 1 Apis. The following year, the ship Maersk Essen lost about 750 containers, while the Maersk Eindhoven lost more than 260. In both cases, the routes were bound for Asia. These three alone have already accounted for much more than the global annual average of containers lost at sea, which is about 1,382 per year. And the most curious thing is that these events happened in winter. Speaking of winter, it was in the winter of 2020 that the Pacific made history. Scientists recorded a 58-foot-high wave in the ocean, which is equivalent to the height of a 5 or even 6-story building. In general, a wave is considered giant or extreme when it's more than twice the height of the others around it. This one, however, was almost 3 times bigger than the rest. Now, it's important to remember that despite being rare and scary, these waves are not a tsunami, as they're caused by wind. Tsunamis, on the other hand, usually occur after underwater earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. Another big monster of the Pacific are typhoons, and the 2024 typhoon season confirmed this. One of the highlights was Hurricane Christy. It did not touch the crust, meaning it did not cause direct damage, but we cannot underestimate it. Christy reached Category 5 on the Saffir-Simpson scale, which is the maximum level. A hurricane of this degree is considered catastrophic, so it's no wonder that it was powerful enough to generate huge waves and extremely dangerous rip currents. In addition to this, there was also Super Typhoon Yagi, which hit the Asian continent with such force that it gained the reputation of the most powerful in the last 70 years. When it arrived in Vietnam, it caused around $1.6 billion in damage, destroyed infrastructure in several cities, and left a trail of victims wherever it went. As if that weren't enough, the Pacific is also home to one of the most unstable regions on the planet, the famous Pacific Ring of Fire. It's a huge, crack-shaped area that's home to intense volcanic and seismic activity. It's the most tectonically active place in the world, as the plates of the Earth's crust are constantly moving there. They move apart and collide, or grind against each other, which causes the region to experience earthquakes and volcanic eruptions all the time. Seismographs record some type of tremor there every 5 minutes. This dangerous region is responsible for about 90% of the planet's earthquakes. So, 9 out of 10 tremors occur within this ring, which stretches across the northern Pacific. And the worst part is that it doesn't just affect North America or Asia. In 2023, tremors linked to the Ring of Fire were felt in several Latin American countries, such as Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, and Peru. There was a trail of destruction, and the lives of around 15 people were lost. There's no shortage of reasons for ships to avoid the shortest route across the Pacific and opt for longer routes. As the popular saying goes, prevention is better than cure.
Welcome to the Spirit of Discovery cruise ship, which will take you on an unforgettable sea voyage around the Canary Islands. The azure endless ocean, delicious food, the highest service, premium cabins, and a terrible nightmare that you will probably remember for the rest of your life. This is exactly how one luxury trip of the Saga Cruises Company ended last year. Instead of relaxing during the cruise, passengers felt fear and horror, and even had health problems. And that's why. On October 24th, the Spirit of Discovery liner started a 2-week cruise around the Canary Islands. There were about 1,500 people on board. About 1,000 were passengers, and the rest were crew members. The first week went great. But then the liner encountered a serious problem called nature. There were strong winds and big waves. The captain decided to return to the UK ahead of time, but the decision was made too late. The ship was caught in a severe storm in the Bay of Biscay. A powerful wind with a force of 11 points hit the vessel. To make it easier for you to understand, the 11-point wind is able to tear out trees together with roots, destroy residential buildings, and plunge entire cities into chaos. Such a storm is rare, but Spirit of Discovery was unlucky enough to get into its epicenter. 11 points is the penultimate place on the Beaufort scale, which determines the wind rating. The most powerful storm has 12 points, and this is a hurricane. The wind reached a speed of 65 miles per hour, which is about the same as the average speed of a car on a highway. Not only did it push the Spirit of Discovery, but it also raised huge waves 25 feet high. Just imagine a wall of water the height of a 3-story building collapsing on a lone ocean liner. At that moment, the captain sent a message to all the passengers through the cabin speakers so that no one left their place. And his voice sounded worried enough. All the passengers had to lie down and hold on tight. According to the witnesses' words, the ship remained caught in the storm for about 15 hours. They held on with all their might so as not to crash into the walls and floor. All this time, tables were flying around the ship, dishes were breaking, furniture was moving all over the cabins. The waves smashed windows, partitions, and doors. Some people were knocked down because they couldn't hold on for so long. The storm hurled the passengers from ceiling to floor, from wall to wall. The ship's crew turned the dining room into a medical area to provide assistance to those who had been hurt. Despite the difficult and terrible conditions, the ship's team did a great job. They regularly informed passengers about the current situation and tried to calm everyone down. There was no panic and chaos on board. When the storm finally ended, the ship continued its journey and finally reached land, where medics urgently evacuated 8 passengers to the hospital. One of them was never able to survive this storm. It's good the ship didn't meet a rogue wave during the storm. This is a natural phenomenon that can appear during a storm and even in still water. It's a giant wave with a height of 60 feet. Like a 6-story house, it collapses onto a ship with incredible speed and capsizes it. And then the wave suddenly disappears. This is no joke. A similar wave has been recorded in the Gulf Stream off of Charleston, South Carolina. It's scary to get in its way. Now, let's go back to the past to remember one of the most terrible maritime tragedies. No, we're not talking about the Titanic. We'll talk about the Greek liner Laconia, which set sail from the English port of Southampton on December 19, 1963, with more than 600 people on board. However, just 3 days later, a terrible tragedy happened to the ship in the boundless waters of the Atlantic. At 11 p.m., in the barbershop hall, an electrical malfunction occurred. The problem led to a fire, which quickly spread to other rooms. The crew couldn't cope with it, since the fire was spreading too fast. The ship's team turned on the fire alarm, but there was no command to leave the vessel. Only 2 hours later, the captain ordered the passengers to evacuate. All this time, people were either relaxing in their cabins or enjoying a party in the ballroom. The crew was probably trying to put out the fire without causing panic. However, when the situation became critical, the evacuation began. People panicked and ran to the lifeboats, but many didn't manage to get inside. One of them was John Morris. He survived this catastrophe and shared his memories of how he put his family in a lifeboat while he stayed on board the ship. He didn't even have a life jacket. Since there was nowhere to go, the ship's crew opened a bar so that people could relax a little. However, at that moment, boilers began to explode inside the ship, and it became clear the vessel wouldn't stay afloat for too long. John Morris decided to jump into the water right in his tuxedo. As soon as he was overboard, he grabbed onto a piece of wooden deck cargo and swam as far away from the ship as he could. The giant liner could sink at any moment, And when such a huge object goes down to the seabed, it forms a water funnel that pulls along everything around. Rescuers arrived at the scene sometime later. Fortunately, John Morris's pregnant wife and young son were alive, but his mother-in-law unfortunately didn't survive the disaster, like many other people that day. Of course, after this incident, the Greek Ministry of Merchant Marine initiated a thorough investigation. For 2 years, they collected information from passengers and the captain, studied the technical characteristics of the ship, and eventually came to certain conclusions. According to them, the ship's crew gave the evacuation order too late. Not all passengers were able to get into lifeboats, but half of those boats remained on board because of the chaos that prevailed during the evacuation. Several officers of the liner were accused of negligence, but the captain and his first mate received the most criticism. As for John Morris, he stated that he felt himself under protection that day. Another unusual story happened on a cruise ship relatively recently. Spoiler alert, the ship didn't sink, there was no evacuation, and the weather was good. However, for many passengers, this journey became a real challenge. Imagine that you've been working for a long time and saving up money to go on your dream trip on the Celebrity Mercury cruise ship in the Caribbean. You arrive in South Carolina, from where the ship begins its journey. You get on board, looking forward to a week's rest. At first, everything is fine. People are having fun, chefs are cooking delicious dishes, and beautiful daytime landscapes turn into night parties. But then suddenly, many passengers start throwing up. Someone is in a hurry to go to the toilet, and someone stays and vomits right in the halls. The cruise turns into chaos. More and more people feel terrible because of unknown poisoning. You also visited the restaurant and eaten seafood, but fortunately, the disease has avoided you, which can't be said for more than 400 other passengers. Almost every 1 in 4 people on board face gastrointestinal problems. There were almost 2,000 people, and a quarter of them are in bad condition. Crew members do endless cleaning. They wash the deck, give people nausea pills, and ask them not to leave the cabin till the illness passes. The captain sends several samples ashore to determine what caused the poisoning. Unfortunately, the cruise is already ruined, and all the passengers have unpleasant memories. So the company organizing the trip issues certificates that can be used on future cruises. It's not the most pleasant experience, but it's still better than nothing. Now, imagine if, instead of just feeling sick, people got infected with some kind of bacterium that would turn them into zombies. It would be much more exciting and scary. Now, do you think you could survive on such a ship full of zombies? And how would you do that? Tell me about it in the comments. The year was 1865. It was a boom of migration worldwide, with novel places discovered and new settlements created. Without planes like we have now, a ship was the only way to escape from the old life and journey towards a new, hopefully brighter future. So, a voyage like that was quite a regular thing to do. More than 500 immigrants safely reached Queensland, and the ship was supposed to head back to London sometime later. It was indeed a long journey, but not many people were willing to return to England. After all, they had chosen to come to Australia to create a brand new life. So it was only natural that the ship would come back nearly empty. However, the return trip was still quite lucrative, thanks to the cargo the ship would carry. The amount of produce ready to be shipped was substantial, primarily consisting of wool soaked in arsenic, tallow, and hides. It was 2 birds with 1 stone. Not only could the crew wait out the winter, warm in Australia, while England endured bitter cold, but they also wouldn't waste their time. With the sheer volume of produce to be loaded, it would take them around 3 months to accomplish this task. Reports were circulating that the Fiery Star was almost done loading up, but it turned out that the assessment was a bit too optimistic. To pass the time, Captain Ewell thought it would be a good idea to reach out to the Acclimatization Society and offer to help transport any animals they wanted to send to England on the Fiery Star. He already had some emus and kangaroos on board, but there was still room. The society held a vote, and they were totally on board, pun intended, with Captain Yule's idea. They figured sending some Taligalas would be a great plan. Even though a few of these birds were already in England, the French society needed a couple, and they could get them shipped there through England. Little did the crew know that all this cargo, all the produce they were willing to sell in England, would ultimately lead to the ship's destruction. Not only was the Fiery Star lost, but most of the people on board did not survive to complete the voyage. March 23rd. That was the day when the ship manifest was finally published. A manifest is a list that details the cargo, passengers, and crew of a ship, plane, or vehicle, primarily for customs officials. This document helps those involved in the transport verify that everyone and everything that was loaded is still on board when the vehicle reaches its destination. Once it's published, it means the ship is almost ready to depart. There were 3 possible ways of passenger accommodation. First, there was the saloon, the antiquated name for first class. Next, there was the second cabin, which is, logically, second class. Finally, there was the steerage, the cheapest form of passenger accommodation on a ship. Back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, many people traveled from their homelands, often to North America and Australia, looking for a fresh start. Most of them were poor and had limited funds for travel. In total, there were 8 people in the saloon, another 8 in the second cabin, and only 21 steerage passengers. Out of the 37 passengers, only one, John Omond, would make it out alive. He bought a ticket for the steerage, so unlike the Titanic situation, in this case, the class didn't really matter. The crew members list wasn't as detailed as the passengers. It was known that, in total, there were around 55 people in the crew, from able-bodied seamen to crew members simply called boys. But there's something telling me that the crew wasn't really that important for the captain. In reality, all that mattered to him was to make as much money as possible, shipping tons of dangerous, flammable cargo. Out of over 50 crew members, only 17 survived that voyage. But there was actually one more crew member who actually survived it all, just because they weren't let in. Sarah Johnson disguised herself as a man and planned to sneak onto the ship. However, something about her looks made the captain get suspicious, so he called the police and made Sarah leave the ship as he didn't want any immoral behavior to take place. Well, he saved her life. For him, it was the last voyage. The captain, W. Hunter Yule, was quite a celebrity apparently. He already had a record of the safe landing of immigrants in the previous year, so there seemingly was no reason to worry. The trip promised to be safe. Clipper Fiery Star left Moreton Bay bound for London. The passengers took their places. The cargo had already been loaded. The full list is astonishing. In addition to all the wool, tallow, cotton, hides, and horns, there were also 6 cases of arrowroot and various other packages. And we can't forget the animals the captain took aboard too. The Fiery Star was far away, yet still observable to the east as it headed toward the Pacific Ocean. This was the last information available until May 26, when news of its destruction emerged from Brisbane. Chief Officer William Sargent's log reveals that the Fiery Star took 12 days to reach the southern tip of New Zealand, passing on April 11, 1865. The trip was going well until heavy seas ruined 2 longboats on April 17. On this day, a strong odor of smoke alerted the captain. When he checked, he found the lower hold completely filled with smoke from a fire fueled by the ship's flammable cargo. The hatches were quickly closed to try to contain the flames, but by the next day, the heat and toxic smoke had forced passengers out of their cabins. George Maber was one of the lucky survivors. He was the ship's engineer, and he recalled the chaotic events on April 20th, as Captain Yule and most of the crew and passengers tried to evacuate in rough weather. At around 6 p.m., the ship took on water, and without much warning, Captain Yule, 4 crew members, and a few female passengers hopped into a lifeboat and headed out. The next boat, managed by the second mate, Mr. Adio, was a gig, followed by a crowded jolly boat. Lastly, there was a waste boat, which was barely seaworthy, with 2 men constantly bailing water to keep it afloat. The plan was for the boats to stay close to the fiery star overnight and head for the Chatham Islands the next morning. But by dawn on April 21st, all 4 boats had vanished without a trace. On the burning ship, there were 17 crew members and passenger John Oman, who banded together under Chief Officer William Sargent's leadership. For 5 days and nights, George Maber pumped water on the fire without rest. He volunteered to go down the forehatch with a rope around him and a handkerchief over his mouth. He discovered that the foremast had been burned through for about 7 inches, and the port side was severely damaged, resembling an empty shell. Exhausted, he returned for fresh air, but later descended again with Quartermaster Marshall to access a water tank. They couldn't open the lid, and as George crawled over the hides, he felt himself sinking. When they reached the deck, they collapsed from exhaustion. The cargo had been destroyed by smoke and fire, and the heat on the deck was intolerable. The crew survived on limited rations and caged chickens, using every spare piece of wood, including pigsties for the pumps. Distressed pigs ran wild in the heat. A raft was constructed, but was too weak for the open sea. Sleep was elusive, and the crew had lost everything, with only hopes of reaching land or meeting another ship. Finally, the Dauntless appeared and sent a lifeboat to the Fiery Star. Captain Moore boarded the Fiery Star on May 12th, and after assessing the situation, he agreed that the crew could do no more. They boarded the Dauntless at 4 p.m., witnessing the Fiery Star succumb to flames by 11:30 p.m. It was a narrow escape.
2 sailors were traveling not far from the infamous Bermuda Triangle when they noticed a boat that seemed to be moving by itself. The sails on it were down and the motor wasn't running. One of the men was Matt Rutherford, the first man to ever sail non-stop on his own around North and South America, who has seen a lot during his voyages. But this one was spooky even for him. An awfully abandoned boat that could be hiding scary things inside. Rutherford still decided to approach and inspect the vessel to see if there was someone aboard who needed help. This story happened in 2013, but the sailors waited for 10 years before they published the footage. The ghost ship, which turned out to be named Wolfhound, looked like an upscale one, and it probably cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It seemed like whoever abandoned it was leaving in a rush. There were clothes and other personal belongings all over the main cabin. Some parts of the ceiling had fallen and some drawers had popped open. Rutherford was afraid to open doors in cabins, so he carefully searched the boat step by step, and luckily found no people who would need help. The sailors decided to tow the ghost ship back to Bermuda. It wasn't easy because Wolfhound was bigger and heavier than their boat. After days at sea, the crew was running low on fuel and asked a passing freighter to stop and give them some gas. They kept pulling Wolfhound with just sail power until the tow line got wrapped around the rudder, and they realized they could get stranded in the Bermuda Triangle. So they had to abandon the ship. After another 23 days in the Atlantic, they finally reached Bermuda. As it turned out later, the mysterious ghost ship belonged to an Irish yacht club member. It got caught in a storm with waves that were 20 feet high and super strong winds, and couldn't continue its voyage. A Greek cargo ship rescued the crew, but they had to leave the ship. Rutherford and his crew found the yacht 9 weeks later. Wolfhound is one of more than 50 ships and 20 planes that disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle since the mid-19th century. The first ship, at least officially documented, was the USS Pickering. It departed from Delaware to the West Indies in 1800. There were 70 people aboard. No one ever heard anything from them ever since. And perhaps we'll never know what exactly happened to them and where the ship is now. The largest ship that has ever disappeared in this mysterious area is the USS Cyclops. In March 1918, carrying a crew of 306 people, the USS Cyclops left Barbados and headed home to Baltimore. It had tons of dense manganese ore on board, which was used in steelmaking. Something happened during its 9-day voyage when it was passing through the Bermuda Triangle. The last message from Cyclops said, "Weather fair, all well," and then it disappeared forever, without even an SOS signal. Another ship that the Bermuda Triangle supposedly took forever was the Cotopaxi in 1925. It was loaded with coal and had a crew of 32 people on board. Its trip was supposed to go from Charleston, South Carolina to Havana, Cuba, but something went wrong and the ship disappeared. Recently, scientists discovered that the Cotopaxi was lying at the bottom of the ocean, about 35 miles from St. Augustine, Florida. Divers who like to go down to the wreck nicknamed this spot the Bear Wreck, but didn't realize they were exploring the remains of the Cotopaxi. One of them, Michael Barnett, was trying to identify the wreck for over 15 years. He carefully measured different parts of the shipwreck that survived underwater with his team. When they compared these measurements with old blueprints of the Cotopaxi, they saw that everything matched up perfectly. The size and position of the boilers were exactly as described in the blueprints. This helped them confirm that they had found the Cotopaxi, and it looks like there was nothing mysterious about its disappearance. It was a combo of bad maintenance, poor care, and rough weather. Many of the hatches used to access the cargo hold where the coal was stored were either broken or missing. This meant that if the ship ran into a storm, water would easily get into the cargo hold, and the ship would get unstable and sink. As the Cotopaxi sailed off the coast of Florida, it met a tropical storm. Just before it disappeared, it sent out a distress call. It was near St. Augustine, so all the puzzle pieces fell into one place. People have come up with all kinds of ideas to explain what might be happening in the Bermuda Triangle. The wildest one is that spaceships from other planets are taking these ships and planes away. Or maybe it has something to do with the lost city of Atlantis, a legendary underwater city. But there are also more rational explanations, such as the fact that this area often has wild and unpredictable weather, with sudden storms and water spouts. For hundreds and hundreds of years, sailors have told stories about giant rogue waves that seem to come out of nowhere in the open ocean. It sounded like a tale in the past, but in the last 20 years, satellites have spotted these freak waves, some of them reaching over 100 feet tall. Storms from the Gulf of Mexico can hit the Bermuda Triangle area and create such rough and unpredictable waves. Scientists built a model of the USS Cyclops and put it in a wave simulator. They say that even a rogue wave 50 feet tall would be enough to flip over that ship. It had a flat bottom and was less stable and more likely to tip. There are also lots of hills and deep valleys on the ocean floor, which can be dangerous if a ship isn't navigating carefully. Sometimes things can go wrong with engines, communication systems, or other equipment. If a plane or ship has a mechanical problem far from land, it can be really hard to get help quickly, especially if rescue teams are far away. The Bermuda Triangle also has magnetic anomalies, so in some parts of it, the compass might point in the wrong direction. And then there are human mistakes, like misjudging distances, making wrong turns, or not listening carefully to directions. This is what happened to Flight 19, a group of planes that went missing. The leader of the flight, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, decided to fly into bad weather without all the equipment they needed. He was also tired, so it was really hard for him to make good decisions. Disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle don't really happen more often than in other parts of the Atlantic Ocean, where a lot of ships and planes travel. They just attract more attention and talks. You still won't find the Bermuda Triangle on any map, and it doesn't have official borders. So we might never be able to solve its mystery because we can't be sure it even exists. But maybe we need to be worried about another Bermuda Triangle, the one up in space. This space triangle doesn't make things completely disappear, but it messes with the equipment on the spacecraft, causing glitches and makes things stop working for a while. The Bermuda Triangle of Space, which is more officially known as the South Atlantic Anomaly, is a unique area above the Earth that stretches over parts of South America and Africa, from Chile all the way to Zimbabwe. It sits right where a part of Earth's magnetic shield is weaker than usual. When a satellite passes through this area, thousands of high-energy particles, especially protons, hit every square inch of it every second. To keep satellites safe from this radiation, space agencies often put them in sleep mode when they pass through the SAA. The Hubble Space Telescope passes through the SAA about 10 times a day and spends about 15% of its time in sleep mode because of this anomaly. Even astronauts on the International Space Station, ISS, which also travels near this zone, have to be careful about radiation. Parts of the ISS, like the kitchen and sleeping areas, have extra shielding to protect them. Cruise ships. Amazing views, exotic destinations. What more could you ask for? While cruising on a megaship is usually super safe, it's good to know some of the secret codes they use on board. One of the scariest things you might hear is Code Red. That means there's a virus running rampant on the ship, and they need to do a serious deep clean. Sick passengers are stuck in their cabins until further notice. But the only announcement that might give you chills is Operation Rising Star, which means a passenger has passed away. On a lighter note, Operation Bright Star, not to be confused with Brightside, refers to a less critical medical emergency. If you hear PVI, that stands for a public vomiting incident. Yep, you heard that right. Some cruise lines have their own versions of this and just yell Purell, Purell, Purell to get the crew moving. There are tons of codes to keep track of, and let's be real, it's hard to remember them all, especially if you're not cruising all the time. So, here's a quick tip. If there's a fire or other emergency, you'll hear a general alarm bell. That means 7 or more short blasts of the ship's whistle, followed by 1 long blast. That's your cue to head to the muster station. Cruise ships are packed with unexpected features that many folks, especially first-timers, might not realize. Some of these floating hotels are massive, almost like small cities. While it's pretty easy to get the hang of all the fun stuff, think water parks, tattoo shops, and tons of dining options, there's also a whole hidden world below the decks that remains a bit of a mystery. So in most cases, there's a morgue, which makes sense as you never know when you hear Operation Rising Star. With millions of passengers cruising every year, it's sadly not uncommon for people to pass away on board. Because of this, many ships are equipped with a morgue and extra body bags just in case. Usually found on the lowest deck, the morgue is a small, stainless steel room that can hold anywhere from 2 to 10 bodies, depending on the ship's size. If someone dies, the ship's staff will alert the authorities back on land. A medical team will check things out and then move the body to the morgue until arrangements can be made. Typically, the body is taken off at the next port, but sometimes it stays on board until the cruise wraps up. Okay, and what if there's a real criminal aboard? Spoiler alert, you won't find any police on a cruise ship, but most of them still have a small jail, often called the brig. If passengers get a bit too rowdy and breach the cruise line's rules, the security team might just lock them up for a while. Yeah, it's not an official jail, it's more like a detention center. Cruise ships are fantastic for socializing, but sometimes you just want a quiet spot to relax and recharge. Luckily, there are plenty of secret hideaways on even the biggest ships where you can find your peace and soak in the views. To start, aim for the forward or aft ends of the ship. These areas are usually less crowded. You'll find cozy deck chairs, hot tubs, and maybe even the space to yourself. Check out the ship's daily schedule to spot activity-free lounges. For instance, the observation lounge might be empty during certain hours, and many ship libraries are perfect for a peaceful nap. On Seabourn, try the aft pool and hot tubs on Deck 5 for serene ocean views. Carnival ships have hidden forward decks where you can enjoy captain-like vistas. Royal Caribbean's Oasis-class ships have a track area at the back where you can relax while watching joggers. Viking's Explorer's Lounge has a quiet second level that's often overlooked. Disney Magic and Wonder have a little-known lookout on Deck 7, while Silversea's Silver Origin features a stargazing platform perfect for night sky watching. Royal Caribbean's helipads and Carnival's Deck 5 Lanai hot tubs are also great gems for some sunshine and tranquility. Now, when you think of pirates, images of Captain Jack Sparrow likely come to mind. Sure, there was media hype around Somali pirates, but are they still a problem? Not exactly. But even so, passengers on cruise ships traveling through high-risk areas near the Horn of Africa can be briefed on what to do if pirates attack. To keep things safe, outdoor activities must be shut down after dark. Cabin lights are better to be dimmed, and passengers are normally told to stay inside their rooms if warned of a potential attack. Despite this, the risk to cruise ships remains low. There's never been a successful attack on one. Anyway, experts admit that it's quite challenging to identify threats in these vast waters. While small pirate boats might be faster, larger cruise ships can usually outrun them and have structural features that resist boarding attempts. Measures like razor wire and fire hoses are among the defenses cruise lines employ to keep passengers safe. Though cruise lines stay tight-lipped about their specific strategies, ensuring passenger safety remains their top priority. Also, when you board your cruise ship, there are some key terms you should know about the layout. The front is called the forward, and the back is the aft. You'll find staterooms on both sides and in between, each with its own perks. Forward staterooms offer fantastic views, letting you enjoy the scenery just like the captain at the bridge as you sail into port. These rooms often have a bit more space thanks to the ship's angled shape. However, keep in mind that they experience more motion from winds and waves, which some cruisers love. While forward verandas are rare and can be windswept, the ocean view staterooms here often feature bigger windows for amazing vistas. On the flip side, aft staterooms provide stunning views of the ship's wake and great sights as you leave port. These rooms also typically have larger verandas, sometimes L-shaped, perfect for relaxing. Many dining options are also found towards the aft, making mealtime convenient. Just know that these rooms can be a bit further from elevators, requiring some extra walking. Don't forget to check the ship's deck plan before booking. If noise is a concern, avoid staterooms near busy areas. And finally, higher decks are usually pricier but offer better views and access to pool decks. Hey, you know how I-95 is one of the most crowded highways in the US? Well, there's also an I-95 on cruise ships, but it's just a hallway. This I-95 is down on Deck 0, and that's where the crew is hustling away under your feet. It's the crew's lifeline, where they do their laundry, hit up the nurse if needed, transfer your luggage, and sneak back into their tiny cabins for a breather. Now, if you romanticize working on a ship, let me try to talk you out of it, especially if you're into food. You won't be treated for leftover stuff. These are just rumors circulating online. It's true that the food isn't as luxurious as for passengers, but it's still quite okay. And if someone from the crew wants to treat themselves to something special, they can make a trip to a grocery store at a port to stock up on their favorite snacks to enjoy in their cabins. Yep, the crew members literally live on a ship. Their rooms are tiny and don't even have windows. Picture a bunk bed crammed into a space where the top bunk is so close to the ceiling, you end up bumping your head every morning. They have a tiny closet and just 2 drawers, which means you can only fit a couple of outfits. And what about bathrooms, you may ask? They're so cramped, you could sit on the toilet, take a shower, and brush your teeth all at the same time if you really wanted to. As for sleep, they don't really sleep at night. Instead, they catch cat naps throughout the day. It's tough to squeeze in a full night's sleep when shifts can last over 12 hours, and any free time usually goes to traveling, eating, or partying. If we're happy enough finding a few bucks we forgot about in our pockets, just imagine stumbling across $13 million in a place you'd never expect. That's exactly what happened to a group of diamond miners working in the Namibian desert. In 2008, they found this incredible treasure inside a shipwreck that happened over 500 years ago, and the story behind this abandoned vessel is packed with mysteries. It all started back in 1533, when the Portuguese built this special trading ship. This model was believed to be a part of a newer class of vessels that were bigger, more efficient, and tougher than the ones that came before. Portugal really needed that, since they were dominating trade all over the seas at the time. So the main purpose of this ship was to support those long-distance expeditions during this super prosperous era. On March 7th, the Portuguese decided to test their impressive new ship, and on that fresh spring day, big vessels sailed down the Tagus River and out into the Atlantic, with flags flying and colorful fabrics draping from their tall masts. Off they went, leaving Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, and heading for Western India. At least, that's what researchers think, since this was a pretty common route for them back then. Most of the time, the Portuguese were after spices. In the early 1500s, it was pretty hard to find things like cinnamon, ginger, cloves, black pepper, and turmeric in Europe, so they had to go to India for them. Unfortunately, one of the ships never made it to its final destination. In fact, to the despair of the Portuguese court, this vessel completely vanished, leaving no sign of a shipwreck. And none of the roughly 300 people on board were ever found. Could they have strayed so far off course that they ended up in the Americas or on some island along the way? Well, anything was possible, and the ship, along with the mystery of its disappearance, became legendary. Fast forward over 500 years to 2008. Diamond miners were doing their thing on a coast near Oranienburg when they started finding some strange stuff while digging, like pieces of metal, wood, and even odd objects that looked like bronze pipes. That was definitely strange, so they called an archaeologist to figure out what was going on. When the archaeologist arrived, he noticed all sorts of strange bits and old pieces scattered around. Little by little, he began to identify those things. First, elephant tusks, then a 500-year-old artillery piece. All of a sudden, it hit him. This was definitely a shipwreck, but what the archaeologist didn't realize at the time was that this shipwreck turned out to be one of the most significant ever found. Back then, it wasn't easy at all to convince the mining company that archaeologists had to keep exploring the site. But thankfully, they managed to, because on the 6th day of searching, they spotted a treasure. And they literally filled their hats with over a 25-pound mixture of Spanish and Portuguese gold coins. Turns out, this old abandoned ship was loaded with gold, tin, ivory tusks, and over 40,000 pounds of copper ingots when it met its watery and tragic end. In fact, specialists believe that the copper ingots played a key role in keeping the wreck so well preserved. The first reason is kind of obvious. The copper ingots weighing everything down, keeping the shipwreck remnants at the bottom of the ocean. And that was great, as 5 centuries of storms and waves would have washed everything away. But copper ingots were also important for another reason. Fish and other sea creatures might feast on wood, jute sacks, and leather shoes. But copper really ruins their appetite, which means a lot of stuff survived those 500 years at the bottom of the sea that it really shouldn't have. So yeah, against all odds, the treasure was preserved and in excellent condition. The gold looked shiny and intact. While it's impossible to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had just found the legendary Portuguese vessel, all the evidence points to the fact that, yes, they did. One piece of evidence comes from an old Portuguese book that says that between 1525 and 1600, 21 ships were lost on the way to India, and one of them actually sank somewhere near Namibia, getting lost on the turn of the Cape of Good Hope. Bingo! From that point on, experts have been going over the wreckage, measuring, photographing, and scanning the site millimeter by millimeter with a high-tech three-dimensional laser scanner. Their goal was to figure out what happened to this ship, or at least get closer to the truth. The first question they had to answer was, why was this ship so close to the coast of Namibia? We're talking about great sailors who probably knew that that stretch of coast was famous for its storms and fog. What happened then? It seems that 4 months or so after its grand departure from Lisbon, the fleet was struck and scattered by a huge storm. So the most likely explanation is that the combination of bad weather and heavy cargo forced the captain to run the ship aground on purpose. According to one theory, he dropped the front anchors and slowly beached the ship. Then it hit an underwater rock in the surf, rolled over in the big waves, and all attempts to free it failed. It began to break apart, starting with the upper structure. At that point, the treasure chest fell out of the captain's cabin and sank down to the seabed. It eventually got crushed and pinned down, but it was also protected by a big piece of the ship's side that broke off when the hull fell apart. Okay, but what about the people on board? Winter storms along the Namibian coast can be brutal, with winds over 80 miles an hour and huge waves, making it nearly impossible to get ashore. But if the storm calmed down at some point, it is possible that the shipwreck had survivors. I mean, some human toe bones were indeed found, suggesting at least one person didn't make it. But these were the only human remains that were recovered. There weren't many personal belongings found either, which leads archaeologists to think that most people on board likely made it to land despite the ship breaking apart. But we can't really say this was a happy ending. Yes, most of them might have survived the shipwreck, but they ended up in one of the harshest places on Earth, an empty stretch of sand and scrub for hundreds of miles. It was winter, so they were cold, wet, and exhausted, with no hope of rescue. Nobody knew they were alive or where to find them. Plus, no ships were likely to pass by, since they were far off the usual routes. Going back to Portugal seemed impossible. After the first round of exploration, researchers found that the ship's remains were scattered across 3 large sections along the coast of Namibia. In the end, more than 40 tons of cargo were recovered from the site, and thousands of different artifacts were found and cataloged, including lead, tin, textiles, and even some astronomical instruments. So, you might be asking, who got the gold? I'll just say that it didn't go to the miners or the archaeologists. According to the researchers involved, every single coin was handed over to the Namibian government. After all, that is the usual procedure for random ships found on the beach. But this case wasn't that simple, as there is an exception to this rule. If the ship found is a state ship, the country that owns it has the right to receive the treasure. In other words, everything they found inside this old abandoned vessel actually belonged to Portugal, no matter that it all happened ages ago. But the Portuguese leaders apparently allowed Namibia to take the lot.
The Nemi ships were massive vessels built by the Romans over 2,000 years ago, complete with marble floors, colorful mosaics, and even plumbing for luxurious baths. Unlike the typical ships of their time, which were mostly used for transport or battles, these were true floating palaces. But the Nemi ships weren't just feats of Roman engineering and luxury. Their story is a wild one. Lost, found, and lost again, these vessels became the focus of a mysterious saga that's puzzled historians for centuries. The first strange thing about them is related to where they were found. These huge wooden ships were lying at the bottom of Lake Nemi, a volcanic lake with still calm waters, located about 19 miles south of Rome. For ages, local fishermen knew about the wrecks, and rumor has it they were taking advantage of that. They'd use grappling hooks to pull up pieces and artifacts from the Nemi ships, selling them at the markets. That went on until 1446, when some noblemen decided enough is enough and started looking into the legends about the Nemi ships. They realized it wasn't just a fish story. Both vessels were actually sitting about 60 feet deep in the lake, and from there, the mystery only grew. When you think about it, 60 feet isn't that deep, and Lake Nemi is pretty small, only 1.1 mile wide and about 100 feet deep. So why build such massive ships in such a small lake? It doesn't really make sense, especially when we find out who built them. The Roman Emperor Caligula. You know, the one known for being one of the cruelest and most unpredictable Roman leaders. But one thing almost everyone can agree on was his impeccable taste for all extravagant things. Caligula spent money like crazy. It's generally assumed that he blew all the imperial treasury in a year on lavish festivals, feasts, and pampering animals. Yep, he supposedly fed his favorite horse oats mixed with gold flakes. Anyway, he loved excess. So again, why did he build two massive ships in such a tiny lake? Experts think Caligula might have built them there because of the lake's connection to Diana, the deity of the hunt, the moon, and nature, who is worshipped at a sanctuary on the northern shore of the lake. By the way, Nemi is a modern name that we see on today's maps. The Romans used to call the lake Speculum Dianae, which means Mirror of Diana. So it is possible that Caligula saw this as the perfect place to hide away and dock his pleasure barges. He wanted extravagant floating palaces, and that's exactly what he got. The Prima Naie, which means first ship in English, was an enormous 230-foot-long vessel. It's almost as big as today's largest passenger aircraft, the Airbus A380. The ship's hull was split into three main sections, with the back wider and the front narrower. It had two big structures at each end, connected by stairs and hallways, giving the ship an odd look, unlike anything else from ancient times. The Seconda Nave, or second ship, was even bigger. It was in deeper water and farther from the shore, making it harder for people to reach it, which also helped preserve it better. The ship was 240 feet long and 79 feet wide, with a kind of building at the back and a smaller one at the front. Even though the front and back structures were missing at the time the ship was discovered, you can still tell they were there from the way the decks were laid out. These ships were absolutely incredible. They were built with the finest materials. Elaborate mosaics made up the stunning floors, bursting with color, and high-grade marble added a touch of elegance and luxury to the interiors. The ships also had 10 banks of oars, baths, galleries, saloons, and even gardens with vines and fruit trees. Yes, gardens, on a boat. Caligula clearly wanted these ships to be his own private paradise. It's said he threw wild parties on board, where his bad behavior knew no limits. This included having scandalous relationships with the wives of his generals and senators. These ships were definitely designed to impress, showing off not only the wealth and power of the emperor, but also the amazing technical skills of Roman engineers. Evidence suggests that the vessels had technologies we thought weren't developed until later. They had advanced plumbing systems, with some sources suggesting they even had running water. There's evidence of bronze pipes and lead drains, which is insane for ships built in the 1st century. Another thing is that wooden beams were covered in lead to keep away shipworms, those tiny mollusks famous for tunneling into and digesting wood. But the engineers' efforts were a bit pointless in this case, since shipworms don't live in fresh water. There's also a theory that one of the ships had a rotating platform. We still don't know its exact purpose, but it may have been used for the revolving presentation of a statue, probably of Diana, or for entertainment purposes, like guests enjoying their meal while slowly spinning and taking in the view. Who knows? All of these findings have led experts to believe the ships were mainly built for recreation or ancient rituals, or maybe both. Basically, the true purpose of the Nemi ships remains a mystery because there is no solid historical documentation talking about it. Now, even though these ships were technological marvels, they didn't last long. They had only been in use for about a year before Caligula's reign ended. Eventually, the ships were damaged, filled with stones, and sunk to the bottom of Lake Nemi. This brings us back to the story of their discovery. In 1446, They confirmed the wrecks were there, but no one could get them out. Then, in 1929, Italy's leaders decided to drain the lake to rescue the ships. So they pumped out 65 feet of water. It took years to get them out of the mud, but the second ship was finally raised in 1932. During the excavation period, archaeologists found a bunch of precious artifacts from the wrecks. Little by little, vast anchors, bronze decorations, and marble statues came up from the depths, along with fancy oar rings, bronze joints, and copper roof tiles. The cost of these ships must have been astronomical. Recovering the memories and artifacts of Roman times was a very important thing at the time, so taking the ships out of that lake was a huge win for Italy. In 1936, they decided to build a museum to showcase the wrecks and let people visit. But their story took a tragic turn. As you probably know, this was a time really messed up by global conflicts, and Italy was no exception. In 1944, a fire broke out at the museum, destroying the ships and all the important archaeological contents. Okay, so we may never know for sure who started the fire, but we do know the largest ancient ships ever discovered were lost in it. Only some bronze pieces, a few charred timbers, and some other artifacts that were stored in Rome survived. But just like a phoenix, the vessels came back from the ashes thanks to a lot of hard work in rebuilding. After the restoration work, the museum in Nemi was reopened in the 1950s. If you ever visit it, maybe you can see a part of a green and red mosaic floor from one of the ships, which, funny enough, got lost at some point and was used as a coffee table in a New York apartment for over 50 years. With all the tragic twists in the Nemi ship story, who knows? Maybe there are still pieces of these floating palaces hidden in different parts of the world.
There's a stretch of water that even the most experienced explorers fear. No matter what season you choose to cross it in, you risk meeting face-to-face with waves that can reach as tall as the Hollywood sign. I'm talking about the Drake Passage, the waterway connecting the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, stretching from Cape Horn at South America's southernmost tip to Antarctica's South Shetland Islands. It's about as wide as the distance from London to Berlin and takes up to 48 hours to cross. Some sailors compare getting on the other side to going to the moon. That's how challenging it is. Even the man who discovered it, Sir Francis Drake, never sailed these waters because they seemed too dangerous to him and opted for a calmer, although longer, Strait of Magellan. The passage took the lives of around 20,000 sailors and over 800 ships. Tourists who want to see Antarctica cross the Drake Passage on a regular basis, although it's still often called the world's most terrifying ocean crossing. The Antarctic Peninsula, where travelers go, isn't really part of Antarctica itself. It sticks out and points towards South America like two fingers almost touching it. The water gets squeezed between these two land masses, making strong ocean currents. The passage is part of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the largest ocean current on Earth. The water rushes through the passage at a speed between 95 and 150 million cubic meters per second, which makes it rougher. And then there are winds that usually blow from west to east and are very strong between 40 and 60 degrees latitude. That's why those areas are called the Roaring Forties, Furious 50s, and Screaming 60s. Land slows down winds, which is why storms hitting Ireland and the UK get weaker as they move east. But Drake's latitude is the only place where winds can blow all around the Earth without being stopped by land. So they keep getting faster. These strong winds turn into huge waves that can hit ships really hard, normally around 13 to 16 feet tall. They're much higher than waves in the Atlantic. Drake Passage also has underwater mountains that you can't see. The huge current squeezes through this narrow passage and causes waves to crash against these mountains underwater. These internal waves create whirls that bring cold water up from the deep ocean. So it's not just rough on the surface, the water is wild all the way down. The first sailor managed to sail around Cape Horn and through the Drake Passage in 1616. It was a Dutch navigator, Willem Schouten, in 1616. But the most famous attempt to cross it was undertaken by Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton on his ship named Endurance. He and 27 of his men set off from South Georgia, aiming to reach Vassal Bay in Antarctica. But things didn't go as planned. On January 19, 1915, their ship got stuck in the ice. And by October, it began to sink. They camped on floating ice for 2 months before sailing lifeboats to a remote, icy place called Elephant Island. Shackleton and 5 men made a risky journey to South Georgia to get help. It took them 15 days to cross Drake Passage with hurricane winds. Finally, they arrived safely and organized a rescue for the rest of their crew. Scientists found the shipwreck of Endurance only in 2022, 10,000 feet below the water. In December of 2019, 6 fearless athletes decided to cross the Drake Passage by rowing a boat for the first time in history. It took them 12 days of non-stop rowing with a 90-minute rotation of rowers. They managed to do it, and it was probably the hardest possible way to cross the passage. The athletes mentioned it was cold, wet, and dirty, and the waves hit them like walls. The weather in the Drake Passage changes a lot, but ship captains can always see it coming and change their path. They will move the departure time to have a safety margin and not to get stuck in the middle of the passage in the worst possible conditions. Sometimes, the journey will be smooth and calm, and they call it Drake Lake. Other times, people on the ship will feel rough waves, which is called Drake Shake. Some experienced captains who often cross the passage say that the Drake Lake effect happens once in every 10 crossings, and they see the Drake Shake once or twice in every 10 journeys. A schooner or a kayak will probably not survive the journey among giant waves, but modest vessels and cruise ships have sturdy hulls and advanced stabilizing mechanisms. So, the journey isn't that dangerous anymore, but still, it's quite an adventure, especially if you're seasick. If you don't feel like risking it but want to travel from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean by water the fast way, the Panama Canal is waiting for you. People first started thinking about making a water path across Panama in the 16th century. Back then, a Spanish explorer found out that only a thin piece of land separated the two oceans. But it seemed impossible to build it because of the mountains and thick jungle, so the idea had to wait a couple of centuries. Finally, in 1880, France, led by the man who built the Suez Canal in Egypt, tried to make the canal. But the people who started the construction soon found out it was much harder than it looked on a map. The land in Panama was one of the toughest and most dangerous places to dig a big waterway. Workers had to literally move huge mountains in a jungle full of snakes, where it was really hot and rainy. During the wet season, heavy rain turned rivers into wild rapids and soaked the workers. Sometimes, they didn't see the sun for 2 weeks, and their clothes stayed wet all the time. Big rocks were falling, and tiny mosquitoes that carried malaria made people very sick. And then, an earthquake happened on top of everything. They were losing thousands of people. That's why France decided to abandon the project after 7 years. Then, the United States bought the French assets in the canal zone and finished it by 1914. It cost the US around $375 million. The 50-mile-long passage of water saves ships traveling between New York and San Francisco 7,872 miles. Around 14,000 ships use it every year and pay around $1.8 million in tolls. So it looks like it all paid off. Another challenging waterway in this part of the world is the Amazon River. It's around 4,300 miles long and flows through 3 countries with over 30 million people living in its basin. But there isn't a single bridge across it. The river has many marshes and soft soils, so engineers would need to build very long bridges and very deep foundations, which costs a lot of money. Building bridges over deep water is tough, but in other places in the world, engineers can use things like floating platforms to help. The river's path and water levels change a lot during the year. During the dry season from June to November, the river is usually 2 to 6 miles wide. But in the wet season from December to April, the river can become as wide as 30 miles. and the water level can rise by 50 feet. That's why they can't build floating bridges or pontoons. The riverbanks are made of soft dirt that moves and erodes with the seasons, and it makes things even harder. It would have to be an absolutely unique project to overcome all these challenges. Luckily, there's no pressing need for a bridge across the Amazon right now. The river mostly goes through areas that are sparsely populated, so there aren't so many major roads to be connected by bridges.
There's a ship drifting somewhere in the ocean without a crew. The last time someone saw it was over 50 years ago. Its story reminds of that of the Flying Dutchman, a ship that's bound to sail forever and bring disaster to whoever sees it at sea. At least the legend says so. Unlike the Flying Dutchman, the SS Bay Chimo was definitely real and built for a German company in Hamburg and began as an ordinary cargo ship. It was trading supplies between Hamburg and Sweden in the Baltic Sea starting from 1914. It had a strong steam engine and a hull made of steel. A few years later, it became British property. Then, in the 1920s, a Canadian company purchased it for around $18,000, a huge amount of money back then. The new owner, the Hudson's Bay Company, was actively using the ship for several years. They would often send it on voyages from its home port in Scotland to Siberia, Alaska, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. It also passed through the Panama Canal and even the Suez Canal, with fur pelts for sale on board. Sometimes it would also transport passengers. It had completed 9 successful voyages before this strip of good luck came to an end. Starting from the 1930s, SS Bay Chimo would have trouble with ice and storms. When it first got trapped in ice in October of 1931, some of the crew managed to escape to Alaska. 15 of 22 sailors decided to stay with their vessel and try to save it. They had furs and other valuable cargo worth around $58,000 aboard. The company sent them supplies to survive the winter. They set camp near the ship out of the hatches, tarpaulins, and other materials, and offloaded the cargo. At the end of November, a blizzard rushed through the area, and it seemed like it had taken the ship with it. The ice platform had survived, but the ship broke free. Some of the crew members were sure it had sunk. But soon after, they heard from one of the locals who had spotted their ship around 45 miles away from their camp. The crew moved on with their lives, and the ship started its journey as a runaway vessel. People would spot SS Bay Chimo once a year or so, all the way until 1965. It was mostly spotted off the coast of Alaska. A man going to Nome with his sled dog, along with prospectors, explorers, and treasure hunters, all claimed to have seen SS Bay Chimo. Someone tried to board it and take it to port, but ended up stranded on it for days because of horrible weather. Others got luckier and managed to take a whaleboat, some furniture, and other valuables from the vessel. Those who got close to the ship saw that it was damaged and missing the propeller. Still, it stayed afloat without a crew for at least 38 years and became the longest sailing ghost ship in history. In 2006, the Alaskan authorities started a project to solve the mystery of this ghost ship of the Arctic and finally find SS Bay Chimo, either still above or below the water. So far, the project has not been a success. SS Bay Chimo remains one of the estimated 4,000 ships that have disappeared off Alaskan shores. If the legend of the 17th century isn't lying, this ghost ship could be sailing somewhere along the Flying Dutchman. It belonged to the Dutch East India Company. Its captain managed to do the impossible for that time and sailed from Holland to Indonesia in only 3 months. They said he was flying over the sea, and some evil tongues explained that he had made a deal with evil forces to achieve that. Once the ship was sailing back home, its captain and crew disappeared without a trace. There are many versions of what happened to it. One of the first ones said it had tried to enter port at the Cape of Good Hope, got in a terrible storm, and sank as there was no captain to save it. Another legend says the captain had refused to obey the skies to let the ship sink during the storm. A scary life form then struck the boat and the crew, and it was condemned to forever wander without rest. Many sailors claim to have spotted the wandering Dutchman. The Duke of York, who was to become King of England, mentioned having seen it in Australian waters. Right after spotting the ship, the man who saw it first fell from the top of the mast and didn't survive. There were more encounters with this legendary ship up to the middle of the 20th century. Ships would nearly collide with it as the Flying Dutchman jumped out of the blue. Scientists have a more logical explanation for this mystery: Fata Morgana, not to be confused with Hakuna Matata. Now, when you're out at sea on a hot day and the air is all wavy, it feels like when you look at the road on a scorching summer day. That's because of something called atmospheric refraction. When light passes through different layers of air with different temperatures and densities, it bends and twists. Sometimes, under certain conditions, this bending of light can create really bizarre optical illusions over the ocean, like sightings of the Flying Dutchman. The Fata Morgana phenomenon can make distant objects appear distorted, stretched, or even lifted above the horizon. So you can see a ship far away, but because of the way the light is bending, it will look like it's floating above the water or even disappearing and reappearing. A Fata Morgana is most commonly seen in polar regions, especially over large sheets of ice that have a uniform low temperature. But you can see it anywhere, even in deserts and over lakes on hot days. The first stories about ghost ships go all the way back to ancient Greek and Roman mythology. One of the most famous ghost ships in history is the Mary Celeste. This brigantine was traveling from New York City to Genoa and was fully stocked with provisions, but missing a crew when it was discovered in the Atlantic Ocean in 1872. The crew's personal belongings were also there, completely undisturbed. The final entry in their log was made 10 days earlier. We still don't know what happened to its crew, and the ship has inspired many spooky stories and legends. The Lady Lovibond was another legendary schooner that is believed to have been wrecked off the coast of Kent in the middle of the 18th century. The story tells that the ship's captain, Simon Reed, had just got married and took his bride on board for a celebratory cruise, despite the superstition that it could bring bad luck. They were on their way to Portugal when the first mate, who is also in love with the captain's new wife, went mad because of jealousy, attacked another crew member, and then took over the wheel and steered the ship straight into the dreaded Goodwin Sands. No one aboard survived, and the schooner is said to reappear as a ghost vessel every 50 years. In present times, many vessels become abandoned and turned into ghost ships intentionally. There are thousands of them floating in U.S. rivers, lakes, channels, and coastal waters. Some people lose their boats in storms and other extreme weather. Others have to abandon their boats because maintaining them can cost 10% of the boat's price. Plus, docking a vessel can add up to several $1,000s every year. Most boats have been made of fiberglass, so an owner can't just recycle them as scrap metal. So, once they want to get rid of it, they often tie it to a dock and sneak away, or leave it floating far away from the shore, or just try to sink it. When ghost ships sink in shallow waters, they can cause damage to coral reefs, mangroves, marshlands, oyster habitats, and wetlands. Plus, they can collide with unsuspecting regular ships and cause real trouble. So, don't do that. Enough said.
If I asked you to name the most famous shipwreck of all time, you'd go with the Titanic, right? The Atlantic Ocean, the hope for new life, heartbreaking love stories. It had it all to become a blockbuster. But I guess you've never heard of SS Princess Alice that submerged in the sewage of the River Thames, taking between 600 and 700 lives with it. Life in 19th century Victorian London wasn't easy, especially for working class folks. Affordable public transport and bank holidays made it a bit easier. The people could escape to the coast on a train or pleasure boat, even if it was just for a day. Sheerness on the Isle of Sheppey in Kent started as a fort under Henry VIII and then grew into a bustling town with a dockyard. When they added a railway station in 1863, it became a prime destination for day trippers and holidaymakers. Seaside promenades, charming piers, and a whole bunch of fun stuff to do by the sea. It had it all. A bit inland along the River Thames, you had the Rocherville Gardens. These gardens had archery lawns, bowls, mazes, lakes, cliff walks, and even a floral bazaar. Plus, there was an aviary, a bear pit, and a skeleton of a lost whale that had taken a wrong turn in the Thames. Londoners of the late 19th century could hop on a train or cruise along the Thames by boat, and both options were pretty popular. But on the 3rd of September, 1878, way more people than usual opted for the boat. They chose it over the railroad after a passenger train had collided with goods wagons in Kent, taking the lives of 5 people. The river felt like a safer way to go. One of the ships available for the trip was the SS Princess Alice. The paddle steamer was first launched in 1865 on the west coast of Scotland. Its original name was the Bute, and it was used as a ferry for the passengers of the Wemyss Bay Railway Company. A couple of years later, it was sold and renamed after Queen Victoria's third child. Then, it was sold again and got the nickname the Shah's Boat, as it transported the Shah of Persia up the Thames to Greenwich in 1873. The ship had gone through several alterations in its lifetime. It got new boilers and watertight bulkheads. The Board of Trade had inspected it and marked it safe. In the year of its final voyage, it was officially allowed to carry up to 936 passengers between London and Gravesend in calm water. On the day of the tragedy, Princess Alice was on what was called a moonlight trip downstream from Swan Pier near London Bridge to Sheerness, Kent and back. The trip wasn't expensive, so most of the passengers were from the working class. There was also a musical band aboard to keep the spirits up. The 3rd of September was a bright day, and many families were happy they could catch some final summer sun rays and enjoy fresh sea air. The then owner of the ship, the London Steamboat Company, had several vessels working on the route. The passengers were free to hop on and off different ships. At around 6:30 p.m., after a beautiful day in the open, the SS Princess Alice headed back to Swan Pier. No one kept official lists of passengers, so we'll never know exactly how many people were on board that evening. But they say the steamer was close to its full capacity. As it got darker and cooler, many families decided to stay inside the saloon or in their cabins below. Some stories from the steamer sound like fate. The captain of Princess Alice let his steerer stay at Gravesend and replaced him with one of the passengers. John Ayres was a sailor but had little experience at the Thames or with a vessel like Princess Alice. Alfred Thomas Merriman, a chef from East London, had been offered to work on the steamer at the last moment. He was 30 years old and a father of 4, so he couldn't say no to extra money. At around 7:40 p.m., he was standing on the deck by the saloon door. By that time, Princess Alice had passed Tripcock Point and entered Galleon's Reach. The passengers could see the North Woolwich Pier in the distance. Many of them planned to disembark at that stop. And that's when Merriman noticed a huge ship carrying coal. It was Bywell Castle. This vessel normally carried coal to Africa, but it had just been repainted at a dry dock. Bywell Castle was going to Newcastle to pick up some coal and transport it to Alexandria, Egypt. The ship's captain, Harrison, wasn't too familiar with these waters, so he called in Christopher Dix, a seasoned Thames River pilot, to lend a hand, even though he didn't have to. The ship had a fancy raised forward part below the deck, and Dix couldn't quite see what was in front of him. So, they had a sailor on lookout duty. As they set sail from Millwall at the speed of 5 knots, 5.7 miles per hour, they tried to stick to the middle of the river, but other boats had other plans. When they were approaching Galleon's Reach, Dix spotted Princess Alice's red port light, headed their way, but planning to pass on the right side. At the same time, Grinstead, the captain of Princess Alice, was going against the river's flow, trying to find the smooth waters on the south side. He adjusted his course, steering into Bywell Castle's path. Both crews realized they were headed for a collision. Dix tried to steer clear and even ordered reverse full speed on the engines, but it was too late. The Bywell Castle collided head-on with the Princess Alice, which was much smaller, weighing less than a third of the 890-ton coal-carrying collier. It sliced the passenger steamer in two. As Merriman remembered later, laughter on board immediately changed into screaming and panic. Some people rushed to the bridge for safety. Merriman hurried to the captain, asking what to do next. The captain's response was grim. "We are sinking fast. Do your best." The ends of the steamer went high into the air, and the middle just sank, taking passengers with it. Those unfortunate ones who were below deck were tragically trapped. The impact caused tons of untreated sewage to gush from outlets near the collision site. The water became a frothy mess of unprocessed waste with a horrible odor. It was potent enough to make even the most resilient sailors retch. Amid the chaos, passengers struggled for life in the contaminated water. They inhaled lungfuls of hazardous waste without knowing. The crew aboard the Bywell Castle sprang into action. They dropped ropes from their deck, urging Princess Alice's passengers to climb aboard. Anything that could float, from planks to barrels, was tossed into the water to serve as flotation devices for those in need. Other members of their team launched a lifeboat, saving 14 people. Nearby boats, moored along the riverbanks, joined the mission, plucking survivors from the water. Many of Princess Alice's passengers didn't know how to swim, and it was even trickier for ladies wearing long, heavy dresses. Merriman was among the lucky ones who could swim. He first held on to a piece of wreckage, and then, when others got to it, swam away and caught onto a rope hanging over the side of the Bywell Castle. They managed to save around 130 people this way. Another survivor was Robert Haynes, who played in the Princess Alice band. He was fond of ships and had noticed the Bywell Castle a couple of minutes before the collision. He chose not to follow the rest of the band, who went downstairs for a break, and that saved his life. Princess Alice's sister ship, Duke of Teck, arrived 10 minutes too late to assist with the rescue efforts. Only 2 people who had been below deck or in the saloon managed to survive the collision. We still don't know the total count of lives taken on that day, but it's somewhere between 650 and 700. And what makes this story even more tragic is that it has been mostly forgotten.
Strange things occur in the cold waters of Antarctica. One of these things happened to a ship called Jenny. It was a small schooner whose history began in 1822. The boat and its crew set sail and disappeared a year later. For 18 years, the ship was considered sunk. People forgot about it, but in 1840, the vessel reminded the world of itself. That year, the whaling ship Hope sailed through the Drake Channel in Antarctica. The crew members noticed a ship among icebergs. It was the schooner Jenny. It was floating slowly in the dark, with no signs of life. The captain of the Hope, Mr. Brighton, gave the order to approach the mysterious vessel. They thought it was some creepy ghost ship, but as they came closer, they noticed crew members on the deck. The sailors of the Hope called out to them, but received no answer. This time, it became clear that something terrible had happened to the Jenny. When Brighton boarded, he realized that the Jenny crew members weren't missing. They were here. Frozen people stood like statues. Brighton went down to the lower deck and found the captain. He was sitting frozen at the table, holding a pen. Brighton looked at the logbook. The last record was made on May 4th, 1823. The captain wrote that he was the only living member of the crew. They spent 71 days without food. It seemed that the ship got lost in the sea because its captain went off course or sailed into an iceberg, but no one knew for sure. After that, nobody ever saw the Jenny again. According to rumors, the crew of the Hope abandoned the frozen ship and left it to drift in the cold waters. According to other rumors, this whole story is fiction. The story of the Jenny was described in a German magazine in the middle of the 19th century. Still, there was no further evidence of the ship's existence. Already in our time, Cambridge University decided to explore the case of the Jenny. The researchers discovered that one of the crew members of the Hope, who didn't disclose his name, told someone the legend of the frozen ship. Someone shared the story with another guy, and it was published in a German magazine called Globus. And that's all. There was no other evidence. One of the most famous ghost ships was the Mary Celeste, and there's no doubt about its existence. The history of this vessel was documented in court. People wrote about it in newspapers, but the most exciting thing is that the ship continued to be used even after 10 people disappeared from its deck. The history of the Mary Celeste began in Canada in 1861. When it was first built, the ship was called the Amazon. It changed captains several times, and it also hit some rocks. The boat was sold, bought, then sold again, repaired, and sailed under the name Mary Celeste. In 1872, it had a new captain, Benjamin Briggs. He was a decent, brave man with a lot of experience in navigation. He had a beloved wife, a daughter, and a son. When he went on his last voyage, he took his wife and daughter with him, and his son stayed in America. In November of 1872, the Mary Celeste sailed from the port in New York with 10 people on board and disappeared. 8 days later, another ship, the Dei Gratia, also left New York and followed the same route. Dei Gratia's captain, David Morehouse, noticed the Mary Celeste and immediately realized something was wrong. The ship was moving too freely, as if no one was controlling it. The captain tried to contact the crew members, but no one answered him. Then, together with other sailors, he climbed aboard the Mary Celeste. The ship was in good condition. There was no damage. The hold was slightly filled with water, but it could be easily pumped out. Everything seemed fine, but one lifeboat was missing. The crew members' valuables were in their cabins. The cargo was in the hold. The supplies of water and food were untouched. Judging by the records in the logbook, the ship was caught in a storm, but it was not too strong. Other ships also sailed through this storm, but nothing bad happened to them. The last record was dated November 25th, and it claimed that everything was fine. The sails of the Mary Celeste were slightly damaged, but perhaps it happened after the crew had disappeared. The whole ship was in excellent condition, but what made the people leave it? Part of the crew of the Dei Gratia stayed on board the Mary Celeste to bring it to dry land. Everything went well. They delivered the ship to the closest port. Next, the captain of the Dei Gratia appeared before the court and told about what had happened. However, the prosecutor and the judge didn't want to believe in the story of the Mary Celeste. They were sure the captain got rid of the ship's crew to get money for its cargo. According to the maritime laws of that time, if you found a ghost ship with valuable cargo, then a substantial part of this cargo belonged to you. So, many people thought that David Morehouse decided to earn some money. This version seemed to be more valid than the one about the mysterious disappearance of 10 people. Fortunately, no one accused the captain of committing a crime. They thanked him for his service and gave him a monetary reward. However, his reputation was damaged, which greatly affected his career, as many believed he attacked the crew of the Mary Celeste. But even after this terrible case, trial, and investigation, the story was not over. The Mary Celeste was still an expensive and efficient vessel. It sailed several times, but then one captain crashed it into the reefs to get insurance. The court revealed this deception and accused the captain of intentional property damage. The story of the Mary Celeste became famous all over the world. People began to build their theories, realistic and not. Someone believed the ship had sailed through the Bermuda Triangle, but this version was quickly refuted, as the route of the Mary Celeste passed thousands of miles away from the Bermuda region. Did the Kraken or another giant monster attack the ship? Nope. Since the boat was found in almost perfect condition, there were no signs of a struggle. One of the most popular versions was that the crew of the Mary Celeste stole some valuable cargo and sailed to Spain on the rescue boat. However, those who knew Captain Benjamin Briggs said he was a good, honest man. Besides, he had a son in New York, and Briggs would never leave him. A more thorough investigation revealed that a series of accidental circumstances could have caused the disappearance of the ship's crew. Before its last voyage, the vessel delivered coal. Perhaps the pump intended for pumping water got clogged with coal after that, and when the ship got into a storm, the hold filled with water and the pump broke. The captain couldn't understand the amount of water because numerous barrels in the cargo hold blocked the view. Benjamin Briggs assumed it was dangerous to stay on the ship during a storm, so he evacuated with the passengers on a lifeboat. Perhaps they were close to land and decided to sail there, but the storm intensified and overturned the boat. Also, one record in the log journal said that the chronometer was faulty. It was a device that helped to determine your location at sea using longitude. Briggs got lost and didn't know which way to sail. The storm was strong, and he couldn't determine whether the ship would sink. Perhaps Briggs decided to leave the ship in a rescue boat when he saw the coast of the Azores. The uniqueness of this ghost ship case is that, unlike many others, you can investigate it yourself. There's a lot of information about the Mary Celeste on the internet. There are documentaries and research articles. Perhaps you'll be able to notice something that others haven't seen and solve the mystery of the disappearance of 10 people.
That's it for today. So hey, if you pacified your curiosity, then give the video a like and share it with your friends. Or if you want more, just click on these videos and stay on the bright side.